Chapter 1 of the Mind the Paint Girl. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Adrian Stevens. The Mind the Paint Girl by Lewis Tracy. Chapter 1. A May morning. The music of the band came nearer. The cold streams were marching from Chelsea to relieve the Grenadiers. Strollers in the park, loungers in Pall Mall and St. James's Street seemed to quicken visibly under the lilt and rhythm of the lively air. A crowd, mostly drawn from the provinces and overseas, had gathered already on the pavement, either beneath the wall of Marlborough House or on the south of Palace Square, and even the case-hardened cockneys who happened to be passing hurried to watch the daily pageant of guard mounting. The oncoming band acted on them as a magnet acts on steel filings. As it approached, each human atom became active. Two men, neither of whom had seen the other, turned out of Pall Mall about the same moment, but on opposite sides of Marlborough Gate. The elder of the pair, unmistakably the type of retired soldier, which ranges from colonel to field marshal, had just quitted a club in St. James's Street. If hair and moustache were white, his figure was trim and erect, and at the martial strains of the band his shoulders unconsciously squared themselves, and his face lost an expression of settled melancholy, singularly out of keeping with spruce attire and military bearing. The younger man, tall and strongly built, was a captain in a line battalion, but walked with the air and swing of a cavalryman. He came from Pall Mall, and a casual glance at the sentry in front of Marlborough House, in order to learn, from the colour of the cockade and the arrangement of buttons on the scarlet tunic, what regiment had been on duty during the previous 24 hours, cost him an opportunity of recognising an old friend. London gives or withholds such haphazard encounters with callous indifference. In ordinary conditions these two might not have met a second time within the year, but now the band, with blood-stirring clash of brass and cymbals, had wheeled out of the park into the Walpent Road, and alert policemen were shepherding the onlookers into compact masses. Again the band wheeled. Some staccato orders made themselves heard above the din of drums and instruments. The old guard's rifles clattered to the present. The new guard became two solid lines of black and red, faced to the left, and moved in toward the square. Then the crowd broke, eager to gain a few yards closer view of the spectacle, and this reshuffling of its units brought the two army men side by side. "Hello, Nico!" "Hello, Colonel!" Their hands met with a ready clasp of friendship. "My wife tells me you are in town. She saw you last night in the stalls at the Pandora, so we were expecting you to call," said the veteran. "Yes, of course, this afternoon, without fail," said Nico Jays. Nico to his intimates, but Captain Nicholas Jays of the North Devons to the wider world. "The CO gave me 10 days district leave, and I reached town from the Curragh yesterday, just in time to dress and eat before going to the theatre." Colonel the Honourable Arthur Stidolph, for all that he was a society man to the tips of his well-manicured fingers, had an incurable trick of allowing his face to betray his thoughts. A slight frown of bewilderment now chased away the smile which had welcomed Jays. 10 days in May!" he exclaimed. "I had a notion you were keen on soldiering, Nico." "So I am, sir. Nobody more so. Yet even Napoleon kicked when he was sent from Paris to Ozon, and the Curragh is a deuce of a hole after Aldershot." Stidolph snorted disapproval. "Put your profession first, my boy, and a jolly long first before the Pandora Theatre and its frills," he said. "You'll hardly believe it, knowing me as you do, but time was when I would have jumped down my junior captain's throat if he had asked for 10 days' leave in the very height of the drill season. Sorry, Nico." For for the tired old eyes had detected a flush of embarrassment beneath the tan of his hearer's cheeks. "That's a beastly inhospitable remark, and you know I don't mean it in that sense. Just for a moment I put myself in loco parentis. Perhaps Satan rebuking sin would be a better simile, because your father died in harness, whereas well, here I am, tiptoeing among the mob to gaze at my own regiment. Dash it all, it's a fine morning. Let's talk of something else." Jays had his own reasons for falling in readily with the suggested change of topic. "Most of the men here are new to me," he said. "Who is the grenadier subaltern with the colours?" "Oh, that's Farncombe, nice boy, son of the Earl of Godalming." "Viscount Farncombe?" "Yes." "Lucky chap. Soldiering is made easy for him." "So it was for me, yet I had to chuck the service soon after I got command of the battalion." Then Jays could have bitten his tongue viciously, if that could have withdrawn the unhappy remark, for it was an open secret that Stidolph had been refused an extension, sure preliminary to a district and a major generalship, because he had married Dolly Ensor, a minor star of the Pandora galaxy. The Honourable Mrs. Arthur Stidolph might have averted the deadly effect of the mésalliance had she been sufficiently plastic to adapt herself to the ways and usages of society, but she was a good deal more of a Pandora girl after marriage than before. She regarded her rise in the social scale as justifying a loudness of manner which the stage manager had sternly repressed on the boards of the theatre, and, as the direct outcome, her husband was shelved professionally. Not that Mrs. Stidolph cared a jot. Married to the brother of an earl, and fairly well provided with money, so long as she remained within the four walls of the law, she could not be ousted wholly from the sacred enclosures of the upper 10,000. Fully content, she tripped joyously through life, and the ex-colonel of the Guards gained as Dolly Ensor's husband a celebrity denied to his military career. In his confusion, the younger man could find nothing to say. As for Stidolph, he was gazing hungrily at the little group of officers who had now broken up into pairs and were strolling to and fro, while sergeants and corporals marched reliefs to the various posts in the precincts of the palaces. The band had become an orchestra, and the conductor, after submitting a programme to the senior captain, raised his baton. When Jays heard the opening bars of a selection, his face brightened. "By Jove, Colonel," he said, "these fellows are bang up to date. They are playing The Duchess of Brixton, and it was only produced a week ago." The older man came back from his stage room. "Yes," he said, "I was there. Mrs. Stidolph is an inveterate first-nighter. Rather a pretty opera, but while I don't pose as an expert in such things, it struck me as lacking the one song or the outstanding bit of acting which usually supplies the clue to a musical comedy." "Oh, I thought it was capital," protested James. His companion laughed mirthlessly. "You would," he said. "You are young enough to watch the twirling feet of the pretty girls rather than pay heed to such trifles as plot and melody." "The rotten thing about the stage," commented Jays earnestly, "is the way genuine talent is burked. I can't say how it is with the men, but where the girls are concerned, an actress depends far more on having a pull with the manager or with some city magnate who is financing the show than on real ability in her work." "I have heard that said a great many times, Nico, yet what little experience I have goes to prove the exact contrary. The managerial or financial pull you speak of will never succeed in filling the house. Grit and genius tell on the stage exactly as they command the prizes in every other profession. Why, I could give you a list of names that would surprise you, and in every instance a woman has forced herself to the front by strenuous effort, backed up, of course, by a good voice and good looks. Look at— Is he governor?" broke in a small man with ginger hair and a bristling moustache, who had been striving vainly to catch the strains of the new opera. "If you wouldn't mind." Then Colonel Stidolph laughed quite cheerfully. "I apologise, my friend," he said. "Doing anything, Nico? Come to my club. We'll have a jaw and an early lunch." "Sorry, I have an appointment farther west." Jays consulted his watch. "I must take a cab," he added. "I had plenty of time to stroll there when I started, but I did not realise how the minutes were slipping along." "And the years. Don't forget the years. See you at tea?" "Yes, sir. Meanwhile, my best wishes to Mrs. Stidolph." They parted. Carrots nudged his neighbour. "Blimey," he gurgled. "I didn't catch his name the first time. An honourable he is. Dolly Answer's husband. Fancy me chipping the old cock like that. But he ain't so dead stuck on the stage, is he, Charlie?" "Knows a damn sight too much about it," said Chorley, who was by way of being a philosopher. Jays was using no polite fiction when he spoke of taking a cab. He seized the first that presented itself, a hansom, as it happened, the taximeter being just at the beginning of its triumphal descent on London, and told the driver to rush him to Hyde Park Corner. The hands of the clock over the lodge-keeper's house stood exactly at 11 as he sprang to the pavement, and he hurried across the Row with an air of urgency, fully explained by the cheerful impatience with which he was greeted by a pretty girl awaiting him near the statue of Achilles. "Caught you tripping at last! You are late, Nico!" she cried. "Only 1 minute," he protested, his somewhat heavy face brightening with joy at sight of her. "I'm at Colonel Stidolph, and I couldn't in decency hurry away, especially as he was lecturing me." "What about? About me?" "No, Lily, thank God. He has never even heard your name." "But, Nico, why so serious? Why should you offer up thanks because I am a Miss Nobody of nowhere, whom no one ever even heard of, as you say?" Evidently the two were bent on some more definite object than a mere stroll in the park, for they had turned in the direction of Stanhope Gate, without any discussion as to the route they should follow. The girl, tall, slim, and quietly attired, moved with an easy, supple elegance. She was young, not yet 20, and youth is naturally graceful, but the expert eye would determine at a glance that she was a dancer, and in all probability an uncommonly good one. A blue serge costume, neat gloves and boots, and a hat by no means flamboyant in style or size, showed that Miss Lily Paradal, though only a coryphée in the Pandora Theatre, did not share the average taste of her class for bizarre garments. Despite her youth, she had graduated in the hard academy of pantomime and music hall, and her companion's fervour with regard to her professional insignificance was hardly justified, since it was no small achievement that she should have won her way already through the most closely guarded stage door in London. The rounded brows over the big, earnest eyes she had raised to her escort's face showed that she was surprised, perhaps a trifle resentful of his tone, and a slight wave of colour heightened and glorified her somewhat pale cheeks. Always pretty, Lily Paradal had suddenly become beautiful, and, had Captain Jays been more finely observant, he might have made the delightful discovery that a bright intelligence was her greatest charm, but he could only feel that he had somehow struck a false note, and he hastened to correct the blunder. "I didn't mean that, Lily, and you're merely teasing me by pretending that you think otherwise," he said. "In fact, poor old Stidolph's remarks ran in a precisely contrary sense. I was grumbling about the difficulty a really smart girl encounters in making a start, in raising herself above the common level, that is, but he stuck out that the stage does really offer la carrière ouverte au talent. How are you getting on with your French?" "Well, enough to understand that," she said gleefully. "And your friend is right, Nico. Not that he, let me see, didn't he marry Dolly Enser?" "Yes." Why do you say yes in that way? Because the Honourable Arthur used to be such a smart chap in my time at Sandhurst, and now he's a back number. He should have done more with his life than simply marry a woman who happened to be a bit of a celebrity. Why didn't he make a career for himself? Happily, Jays had tact enough to check the imminent explanation. He rather lost touch with soldiering, I fancy, he said. But the girl's sharp ears had caught the pause, the careful weighing of the reply before it was uttered. Was it because he married an actress? She demanded, quickly. Good gracious, no. There's no bar to social progress nowadays. Some mischievous thought danced in the girl's eyes, which continued to search her friend's sunburned face inquisitively. Lots of our high kickers marry lords, which is a cut above an honourable, I suppose. She seemed to be musing aloud, but there was no uncertainty in the succeeding question, which was very much to the point. Nico, what would you say if I made a hit, and all the giddy young gadders about town began chasing me? May I smoke? Said Chase. Yes, but answer me. I would be pleased, of course, and frantically jealous, equally, of course. Now, let's chuck problems and admire the flowers. We cross here. The beds begin at the other side of Stanhope Gate. Nico, I'm serious. As to the hit, at any rate, I have been given my chance. What do you mean? Has that silly little ass, Lionel Roper, been filling your head with nonsense? The stalwart captain's voice had grown harsh. He knew that this charming girl was flirting with him innocently, leading him on, and he hated himself for the miserable truckling to convention which held him back from the supreme step of asking her to be his wife. Please don't call Uncle Lal rude names, said Lily, though the tremendous news which she could no longer retain choked down the resentment she would certainly have expressed at any other time. The ill-tempered reference to Roper was quite unwarranted, since he had proved to be a real friend to herself and her mother. I'm thoroughly in earnest. Maury Cooling, our business manager, you know, was growling the other night about the lack of go in the Duchess of Brixton, and Vincent Bland, the composer, he really is a duck. All the girls love him. Remembered that I sang a little ballad rather well one night in the Canterbury, and what do you think? He has written me a song, full stage, with chorus. I'm rehearsing it today for the first time, and I really do believe it will catch on. The concluding words rose in a crescendo of excitement, and for once she was blind to the scowl on her companion's face. Matters had come to that pitch. He was furiously resentful of any influence that might lift Lily Paradell into prominence, lest his own dog-in-the-manger policy should be endangered. But he had the sense and good breeding to conceal his feelings for the hour. By Jove, I congratulate you, Lil, he managed to stammer. Is it a decent sort of song? What's the air like? Oh, it goes with a splendid swing, and it has such a jolly catchword. I'm supposed to be the Mind the Paint girl. This is the chorus of the first verse. Mind the paint, no matter whether Maple's bills are settled or they ain't. Once you smear it, or you scratch it, it's impossible to match it. So take care, please, of the paint, Isn't it great? Can't you hear it on the barrel organs? If only I work it up, as I think I can, it will go through town like the flu. Jays pulled her out of the way of a noiseless electric brougham. In her enthusiasm, Lily had forgotten her surroundings. Though she was only humming a refrain, her artist's eyes were gazing at a dim and crowded house beyond the footlights. She heard the subdued strains of the orchestra. She watched the conductor's uplifted baton. This was her opportunity, and she must seize it with both hands, now. The motor stole past with silent speed. It had crept too near, and might have knocked her down, but for Jays's prompt help. Yet Lily Paradell was still seeing visions, and being a vivacious young lady, she laughed at the careless chauffeur. "Mind the paint," she cried, and a bewhiskered face, crowned by a silk hat, was framed for an instant in the broughams window. "Oh dear!" she sighed. "Now I've gone and done it. That was Carlton Smythe. Whatever will he think of me?" To her, the manager of the Pandora Theatre was a tremendous deity, throned high on some peak of the Thespian Olympus. In reality, he was a shrewd and cautious judge of public taste in musical comedy, and he was thinking that if the girl would only throw as much animation into the new song on stage as she had displayed in the park, the Duchess of Brixton was safe for 100 nights at least. "See what it is to have a steady-going chap like me handy," said Jays. "If I hadn't been just in the right place, you would have been run over." "Nor would I have been singing and generally playing the giddy-goat in Hyde Park. Still, I'm awfully obliged to you, Nico dear. You know you come first all the time, no matter what the future may have in store." She flashed a look at him, and such a wealth of tender kindliness poured from her deep blue eyes that his brain reeled. He could not guess, Lily herself could not have told him, that friendship rather than love inspired that thrilling glance. Youth, abounding vitality, the first glimpse of beckoning ambition, such was the formula of the magic elixir coursing through her veins on that bright May morning. It rendered her more than ever desirable. Given her favour, no man could resist her. And Nicholas Jays was a man, though neither bright nor swift of nature. Least of all did he understand women, or he would have known that Lily Paradell was simply brimming over with high spirits and good nature. When she loved, she would die rather than offer her love. Yet it was a moment fraught with possibilities. A breathed word, a caressing pressure of the girl's arm, and the divine spark might have reached the hidden store of passion in Lily's heart. Jays's gloved hands were clenched fiercely. He was on the verge of what he regarded as a social precipice, when an aristocratic dame, leading a Pekingese dog, met the two as they reached the path, and gave him a gracious nod of recognition. "Who was that?" said Lily in an undertone. "Lady Valetort," muttered Jays. "Friend of yours?" "Yes, friend of my mother's, to be exact." "She didn't forget to look me up and down. You know heaps of people like her, I suppose. Ought you to be walking with me here, Nico?" "Don't talk nonsense. Why shouldn't I walk with you here or anywhere else?" "You might have said it was an honour conferred by me, dear boy, but you didn't, and you're right. I'm not in your set." "That word set is the most detestable word in the English language." "There are others, and we wouldn't use them if they had no meaning. But we're not going to quarrel, Nico, because Lady What's-her-name raised her eyebrows. Here are the flowers. How perfectly beautiful. Now I can see what you meant when you said last evening that we Londoners would call the gods to witness that there was nothing in the world to equal them if we saw such a display in Paris, yet we passed them by unnoticed in dear old foggy London. But who christened them such awful names? Ah, here is something in my line. Don't touch. Keep off the grass. Don't you see, it's another way of telling you to mind the paint. You'll be in town next Monday? Yes, how jolly! I shall feel more at home if I see you in the stalls, grinning like a Cheshire cat and yelling for an encore. Some girls pack the theatre on the first night of a new song just to make it go. But I shan't. I couldn't, if I wanted to ever so. There's only you and Lal Roper and Bertie Fulkerson, if he hasn't dined too well." "Pooh! Bertie Fulkerson, young idiot!" Captain Nicholas Jays was himself again, and the North Devon's mess at the Curragh was spared a sensation. But Cupid, perhaps, stole away among the flowers and sulked until some other youthful pair aroused his interest or sought his sympathy. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of the Mind the Paint Girl. This is a LibriVox recording, All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Adrian Stevens. The Mind the Paint Girl by Louis Tracy, Chapter 2. The New Star. Although Jays was not rich, he was not poor. He had a fair private income in addition to his pay. He was well connected, the envied possessor of uncles and elderly relatives highly placed in the services, in the War Office, and in other government departments. In a word, with that steady attention to work which our British variety of nepotism insists upon, he was certain to find the way of promotion made easy. Nor was there any valid reason why he should not marry. With due economy, he and his wife could not only follow the beaten track of regimental life, but meander into some of its luxurious byways. They would have no difficulty about houses, furniture, a dog-cart, the maintenance of a couple of polo ponies, or the purchase of a smart frock for Mrs. Jays when the GOC's garden party came round. To say the least of it, such conditions warranted a young man in spending a joyous week in London during the height of the season, and yet Jays would have been far happier had fate compelled him to endure the blistering ennui of some sand-encircled cantonment in the Punjab. There he would perforce attend early morning parade, read and smoke or sleep after luncheon, curse the climate at decent intervals, whack a polo ball over an iron-bound maiden, play bridge or billiards at the club, and dine with 20 hard-bitten Britons like himself. Lily Paradell would have been 6,000 miles away, and it was not in his nature to sigh after the impossible. But in London her enchanting, distracting personality yielded odd half-hours of delight, and filled the remainder of existence with a species of sullen despair. Not every morning, because rehearsals were exigent, but as often as she could spare her time, he met her by appointment. Weather permitting, they went to one or other of the parks. She would visit the zoo every day if he would take her, because she loved animals and had a way with her that conquered the doubting shyness of the creatures of the wild, or, if walking meant a trudge through mud and rain, they would drive to the National Gallery, South Kensington, the British Museum, the Wallace Collection. Jays hailed a dismal sky almost with delight, merely because of the educational value of those quiet strolls through galleries and exhibitions. He assured himself that some day he would defy convention and marry Lily Paradell, and he took a keen joy in the task of communicating to her now such scanty knowledge of the arts as he possessed. She was a willing listener, never bored or weary. She had a marvellous memory, forgot no hint of the right way to pronounce foreign and classical names, asked for reasons, and applied them correctly when tested over new ground. With it all there was the pleasing consciousness that Lily looked up to him as a paragon of erudition. To justify her faith in him, he bought booklets on Turner, on Correggio, on the Elgin marbles, on the china of Bow and Chelsea and Meissen, and studied them privily in his bedroom at the club. Then, helped by a quick glance at a catalogue, he would hold forth as to the atmospheric depth of Ulysses deriding Polyphemus, or the exquisite glaze and colouring of a Dresden shepherdess, anno 1760. In truth, he was teaching himself some of these things, and more than once the girl's innate taste, helped by an alert brain which remembered everything, caught him tripping. Nevertheless, his manners and speech were different from Lily's, which still kept a touch of her humble beginnings, and every night, after the sweet intimacy of the homeward drive to Mrs. Upjohn's apartments, the Lily Paradell of the Pandora Theatre was Lily Upjohn in the Kennington Park Road, where she and her mother shared a bedroom and sitting-room en suite, which, in this instance, meant folding doors. He would leave the girl's humble abode with the shivering foreboding of the day when it would be necessary that his mother should call there. Mrs. Jays, poor lady, little dreamed of the impending cataclysm. Daughter of a baronet and widow of a distinguished general, she was a good and charitable woman, beloved by all who knew her, but intensely proud of her birth and breeding. What would she say when she heard one of her sons marrying a Pandora girl? And what would she think when she met Mrs. Upjohn, a typical Cockney, without an H in her vocabulary, save in instances where it was superfluous? Indeed, would the two ever meet? Would not the shocked and anguished gentlewoman emphatically refuse to stain her skirts with the dust of Kennington Park Road? It was no light problem that tortured the big, red-faced, well-groomed captain of North Devons, and there is little wonder that he shirked its solution. So he drifted helplessly through those scattered hours of happiness, and those long-drawn watches of the day and night, when care sat heavily on his shoulders, and thus lent himself to the greater folly of letting "I dare not" wait upon "I would." At last came the Monday when Lily Paradell would be made or marred in her profession. It was a big thing for a girl still in her teens to be given a star turn in the leading theatre of London devoted to musical comedy. If she succeeded, she would leap at a bound to the front rank. If, by some mischance, her song did not catch the public fancy, or if nervousness or excitement robbed her for the moment of her witchery of voice and manner, years might pass before another such splendid opportunity presented itself. In the one event, the number would simply be dropped because Carlton Smythe was noted for a Napoleonic quickness of decision. In the other, were there not a score of girls in the chorus, capable of singing it well, and feverishly eager to prove their fitness? Jays had seen little of Lily during the past 3 days. Every spare minute on Friday and Saturday had been devoted to rehearsal. As for Sunday, Vincent Bland, the composer, to whose initiative her selection for the new part was wholly due, insisted that she should remain in bed all day. Lily, of course, rebelled, but Bland belied his name by firm threats of the direst consequences if she disobeyed his orders. On the Monday, however, Jays broke the custom which permitted Lily to reach the theatre unaccompanied, and convoyed her thither in a cab. As they crossed Waterloo Bridge and the magnificent panorama of London, from St. Paul's to the Houses of Parliament, spread its glories before their eyes, the girl turned impulsively to the man she regarded, in a curiously impersonal way, as her lover. "Nico," she said, "are you bringing anyone to the theatre tonight?" "Bringing anyone?" he repeated. "Yes. Have you taken only one stall?" "I'm not exactly what you might call tiny, but I couldn't slop over into 2, he replied, veiling a vague uneasiness with clumsy humour. "But you have a brother and a mother," she persisted. "Why haven't you invited one or both to come with you? I know you would find it difficult to introduce me to your people. Oh, let me say what I want to say. Surely you and I can speak the truth to each other sometimes. But tonight you might have told them that I was a friend, that you were interested in my success." He was so dumbfounded that he blurted out a more convincing answer than he could have contrived by using his wits. "Honestly, Lil, I never thought of it," he vowed. "My mind has been running on you these last few days to the exclusion of everything else. It would have been quite an undertaking, too. My mother lives in Huntingdon, and Bob is up to his eyes on business. He and some other fellows are taking on a big tract of land in Rhodesia, and they have heaps to do before they sail." For a little while there was silence. No heavy vehicles were near, and the jingle of bells on a group of hansoms or scampering toward the Strand seemed to chime with the golden reverie of a summer evening. "I suppose your ma doesn't even know you're in town," said Lily suddenly. Jays loathed that word ma, and hoped he had cured her of using it. If he had been better versed in the wayward heart of woman, he would have understood that the lapse was intentional, a verbal thrust at all snobbishness and class prejudice. "No," he said gruffly, "I did not tell my mother I had obtained short leave, because she would have expected me to give her at least one night at home, and I wanted every possible minute for you. Sons are mean in that way, but, at any rate, I try not to hurt her feelings." The girl's eyes were shining like sapphires. Seeing nothing, they were gazing fixedly at some early diners in the Savoy restaurant. But her emotions bubbled forth without restraint. Dear Nico, is he grumpy then? And isn't Lily Paradell a horrid little wretch? It's nerves, Nico, just nerves. I'm sitting here at your side, demure as a church mouse to all appearances, but I'm really singing and dancing, flinging myself madly around the stage, a la Lottie Currens in Tarara-boom-de-ay. Yes, I know it's stupid and maybe positively harmful, but I can't help it. It's in my blood. Even you men get it occasionally, don't you, when you gamble away a year's income on a game of cards, or join in a rush for some new goldfield. And I am gambling tonight. This is my toss of the dice. It's make or break with me at 9:15. Now there were 100 ways in which a half-hysterical girl might be soothed by a man who loved her, but Captain Nicholas Jays did not adopt any of them. "You're frightened. That's what's the matter with you," he laughed. "Only a case of blue funk. Every fellow gets it the first time he goes into action, but it vanishes when the bullets begin to sail past harmlessly. But if having the stage to yourself means going into action, I got over that difficulty before I was 14, she said. Then she turned and looked at him, marking his stolid aspect. "You're a bit of a humbug yourself, Nico," she tittered. "You have taught me heaps about pictures and statues and old furniture, but you really haven't got a glimmer of art in your soul. You're just a stiff, matter-of-fact soldier man, and that's the best and the worst I can say of you." He was stirred to defend himself. "You might add that I'm also your very loyal friend and well-wisher," he declared. Perhaps the girl was vouchsafed some glimpse of the mortal struggle raging within, which, in its way, gave a pathetic force to his colourless words, for she placed a hand impulsively on his arm. "I'm more certain of that, Nico, than of carrying the house with me tonight," she said, and there was a tender note in her voice which made divinest music in his ears. "But here we are at the theatre. You'll wait for me, of course. A smart hansom if I knock 'em, otherwise a four-wheeler with a broken-winded Gigi." "Good-bye and good luck." She smiled dazzlingly from the stage door and was gone. He drove to his club, changed his clothes, ate a hearty meal, and was in his stall at the Pandora before the curtain rose. He was familiar with all the songs and most of the lines of The Duchess of Brixton, and soon discovered that the author and composer had given Lily every reasonable chance of finding her feet before her own special item was reached. She had been promoted from the chorus to a definite character, and had something to say now and then. It was noticeable that her speaking voice filled the theatre, and Jay's, slight as was his knowledge of stagecraft, gasped the essential fact that the hard-won experience of the music hall was enabling her to make her personality felt without effort. A printed slip attached to the programme announced that during the first act Miss Lily Paradell would sing a new song entitled "Mind the Paint," and the presence of a number of critics showed that the management was booming the change. As it happened, Jays had not inquired as to the particular incident in the story which led up to Lily's effort, and the introductory symphony was so brief that he was almost surprised when she bounded forward from the back of the stage and began to sing. She had not uttered a complete line before he knew that she was easily first in a cast which included some of the most notable musical comedy actresses in London. Her fresh, pure voice had in it a joyous lilt which appealed to the audience from the opening note, and her light-hearted audacity gave point and significance to some commonplace lyrics. When she danced to the music of the chorus, that same rhythmic refrain which she had hummed in Hyde Park, it was as though some woodland nymph were rapturously displaying her delight in life, the ecstasy of youth, the half-shy yet all-conquering sense of maiden sovereignty. Instantly the house was on the qui vive for the rising of a new star in the theatrical firmament. The hush of expectation was succeeded by a low murmur of gratified discovery. A subtle sense of unanimity in approval spread throughout the crowded audience, and the thunderous applause that broke forth at the conclusion of the last verse was stilled, while the lithe, graceful form was dancing, only to crash out in long sustained volume as Lily bowed herself breathlessly to the wings, darting one last vivid look at the place where she knew Jays was seated. The tumult could not be quieted until the conductor's baton tapped sharply on the music stand, and the orchestra played the symphony once more. Lily reappeared, smiling and self-possessed. She sang an encore without any sign of exhaustion, and when the chorus was reached, the gallery joined in. "Mind the paint! Mind the paint! A girl is not a sinner just because she's not a saint. But my heart shall hold you dearer. You may come a little nearer if you'll only mind the paint, mind the paint." The glance with which Lily rewarded her unknown friends among the gods was one of the many unrehearsed triumphs of the evening. When she danced again, she had the intoxicating ichor of success in her veins. This time there was no restraint, no subconscious memory of stage directions and the studious posturings of her ballet master. She threw her very soul into motion. Her dancing was the physical expression of an ecstatic spirit. And the house wanted more. Londoners, despite the opinion of their American cousins, are quick as any people in the world to recognise real talent, especially in the theatre, and this acutely critical audience realised that they were privileged to witness an event which would be the talk of the town next day. But Lily neither sang nor danced again that evening. Carlton Smythe, hidden in the corner of a box, had signalled a decision negative to the stage manager. For one thing, he did not wish to subject a valuable recruit to undue strain. For another, he was fully content with the sensational effort already secured. So the girl curtsied and laughed delightedly and wafted kisses from her fingertips to the gallery, and when the orchestra increased the tension by replaying the chorus, the recipients of those kisses testified their appreciation thereby by howling lustily. "Mind the paint! Mind the paint! A girl is not a sinner just because she's not a saint." Such moments are rare even in the lives of the gifted. They are precious even to genius. On the stage they are proclaimed aloud with trumpets. In the studio, in the laboratory, at the littered table of the writer, they come in silence. But the artist and thinker quiver under their mighty influence, whether the glad paean is chanted by the voice of the multitude or whispered in the soul's ear by some unseen and awful presence. As achievements rank, it was perhaps a trivial thing that a pretty girl should have shaken the Pandora Theatre from floor to ceiling by a pleasing performance of a song and dance, but Lily Paradell had climbed just a step beyond the high level of artistry imposed by the London stage. Grace, harmony, charm of voice and movement, these were the essentials of her craft. She had superadded a haunting memory of beauty, a sense of unfettered and elusive youth, a new and fascinating variant of the eternal puzzle of femininity. So the patrons of the Pandora simmered with glee because she had tickled their jaded appetites so unexpectedly, and grinned with merriment when the principal comedian gagged them back to the right humour by tripping the impressionable Duke of Brixton, whose instant and callow ardour inspired him to pursuit of the vanished attraction. "No, you don't, Strawberry," he cackled. "This great metropolis wants that fairy yet a while, so keep off of it. Mind the pint." Captain Nicholas Jays, after being carried away like the rest by general enthusiasm, recovered his wits in becoming aware of a certain blankness behind the footlights when Lily Paradell had disappeared, a quite natural feeling which was usurped by a highly disagreeable one. Within a space of 5 minutes or less, the girl he loved had reached the topmost rung of the ladder in her profession. With average good fortune and good health, she was now fairly established as a popular idol. Newspaper paragraphs, interviews, portraits, picture postcards, the clatter of clubs and society, aided and abetted by the solid claims of self-interest which must sway the proprietor of the Pandora Theatre, would put her on a pinnacle from which she need not be dislodged for many a year. King Demos had spoken, and with no uncertain judgment. It was as though he, Nico Jays, standing in front of his company on parade, had been suddenly promoted by his sovereign to command the Aldershot division. Such a miracle could never happen to him, but its equivalent had happened to Lily Paradale. In very truth, he had obeyed Emerson's behest by hitching his waggon to a star, and the notion had a soul-sickening addendum in the knowledge that he was a very plodding waggon to be attached to such a particularly bright and dazzling star. Hardly realizing what he was about, he rose from his seat, trod on several people's toes while making blindly for the stairs, and earned a good deal of angry comment by interfering with one of the leading comedian's most excruciating jokes. Angry, pleased, excited, dejected, at once gratified by the fact that none of these feather-brained fools in the audience could rob him of his intimacy with the girl they had so recently learnt to admire, and aflame with jealous dread lest this night's ovation might prove the beginning of the end of his romance, he reached the foyer and gulped down a whisky and soda. A hand fell heavily on his shoulder, and a guttural voice said, "Ach Gott, Nico, you swallowed that like a stein of Pilsner." He turned. A tall, fair-headed, faultlessly dressed German was at his elbow. "Hello, Baron," he said. "You here? But of course you would be. You're one of the recognized Pandora boys. Someone told me you have been here most nights last week, Nico. But what do you think of the new dancer? Isn't she livid?" Jays bestirred himself. It was imperative that von Rettenmeier, a highly popular attaché at the German embassy and an inveterate gad about in society, should not have cause to quiz him. "You mean Miss Paradale?" he said. "She's more than a new dancer. Why, man alive, she has proved herself the leading actress of them all." "She is good, yes, superb, but there are others who don't get a chance. There's Enid Moncrief, for instance. Now, if Carldon Smythe—" The voluble Baron checked himself sharply, his good-humoured face crinkled in a welcoming smile. "Hallo, Carlton," he cried. "I hope you're pleased. Congratulations. Miss Paradale is a peach." "My dear Baron," said a stout little man, who had approached the bar in company with Carlton Smythe, "you really shouldn't mix Americanisms with your English. I suppose you meant to imply that Miss Paradale resembles a certain luscious fruit, whereas you tell us that she is a tree." "I said a peach, not a peach," protested von Rettenmeier. "Yes, that's the trouble. Why don't you carry a supply of jujubes?" "You're a bit of a cough-drop yourself, loall," snickered the Baron, whose acquaintance with English slang was profound, though his pronunciation might be faulty. The manager nodded to Jays, whom he knew slightly. "A bottle of 96 and half a dozen glasses," he said to the girl behind the bar. "We're just going to drink Miss Paradale's health," he added, addressing the group collectively. "Mind you, this is not for publication, but that song of hers was the one thing wanted." "Souvenirs, 500 performance of the Duchess of Brixton, souvenirs a shilling each, photographs of Miss Lily Paradale, and words and music of Mind the Paint, complete in souvenir, 1 shilling, chanted Lionel Roper, whose bald head was glistening after the excitement of seeing his pretty protégée safely launched in the smooth waters of success. 500, well, I hope so," said Smythe, watching the champagne creaming in the glasses. "You're a pessimist, Carlton, an incurable pessimist," spluttered the stout stockbroker. "You know as well as I do that you've found the real thing in Lily Paradale." "Quite true, my boy, quite true, if only she wasn't so confoundedly attractive." "Con?" Roper's white eyebrows rose to his bare scalp in speechless astonishment. "Yes, I mean what I say. Every titled young ass in town—" Suddenly the astute Smythe remembered that Jays was a privileged friend of the new star. "Ah, well," he said, "here's to her anyhow." The glasses were lifted, but Jays swallowed with the good wine a potion bitter as gall. End of section 2. Chapter 3 of the Mind the Paint Girl. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Adrian Stevens. The Mind the Paint Girl by Louis Tracy. Chapter 3. Whisky and soda and champagne, in layers, are remarkable for their stimulating effect. Jays shook off his gloom. He even talked cordially with Bertie Fulkerson, a pallid, languid youngster whose red-rimmed eyes and generally decrepit appearance suggested that he drank and smoked too much, and walked and ate too little. A plump, jovial-looking, middle-aged man of marked Jewish appearance had lounged in with Fulkerson, and was hailed instantly by Roper as Sam. To the public at large he was known as Mr. Samuel de Castro, a dabbler in literature and the arts, but seeing that his output in these slave-driven occupations was nil, and that he always had plenty of money, which he spent freely as a patron of the lighter drama, it might be assumed that certain whisperings that connected him with a noted firm of rag merchants were not wholly devoid of foundation. He spoke with a pronounced lisp, wore white waistcoats morning and evening, sported a gorgeous diamond, interchangeable as a scarf pin and stud, and was popularly reputed to regret the fact that the white spats he affected during the day were not fashionable at night. He, it would seem, had heard of Lily Paradell for the first time that evening. "Glad to see you, Lal," he said to the stockbroker. "Bertie tells me you know the fair Lily. Won't you introduce me? I suppose all her friends will be meeting her after the show." "You must ask Bland, dear boy. Vincent has kept us bally outsiders in the dark. You too, Carlton, you were just as bad. A regular conspiracy, I call it."
"But Miss Paradell ought to hear what we think about her. Let's get up a supper. Come now, Carlton, be a sport. You can manage it. Just give the word, and I'll order a table at the Catineth."
"No go, Sam, me boy," said Smythe cheerily. He was celebrated as the most genial refuser in the business. "Vincent Bland is a regular martinet in these matters. Kept the poor girl in bed all Sunday, I hear. Actually set her mother to mount guard over her with an axe, or some other domestic implement. And he's right, me boy, quite right. He's too old a bird to allow his prize chick to crock with excitement." Jays decided to assert himself. He was flushed in face and husky of voice, and his gorge rose at hearing these men discuss his Lily without any regard for his presence, as though he were a nonentity. "Mr. Bland would certainly refuse to permit Miss Paradell to attend a supper party tonight," he said, and his strident tone held every ear at once. "But if it's equally agreeable to all of you, why not lunch with me at Catani's tomorrow, say 1 o'clock, sharp, and I'll bring Miss Paradell." No one answered for a second or two, until Roper recovered his wits. "Right you are, Jays," he cried. "You took the words out of my mouth. But youth will be served, eh? What? My little festivity can stand over till you're playing marbles on the Curragh." Jays glanced round. "How many of us? 6? Miss Paradell will invite a few friends from the theatre. Call it a round dozen. May I send her a note, Mr. Smythe? And would you let me use your telephone? I usually take her home in a hansom, but tonight's blaze of glory calls for a brougham." The manager cast a contemplative eye over him.
"Certainly,"
he said.
"Come along, you'll find all the resources of civilization in my room."
"Who's the lordly person?" demanded De Castro when the two had gone.
"Name of Jays, Nico Jays in the North Devons," explained Roper briefly.
Notwithstanding his prompt acceptance of the morrow's invitation, he was annoyed by the young man's air of proprietorship where Lily Paradell was concerned, and was rather inclined to resent it.
"Is he the accepted candidate?"
purred De Castro, who liked nothing better than a chance of stroking his friend's fur the wrong way.
"Not he. He'd like to be, that's all."
"He's a bit of a wet blanket, is poor nigger," grinned von Rettenmeyer. "Let the pretty Lily once get her het free, and it'd up with nigger."
"For the Lord's sake, Baron, have another glass of bubbly and clear your throat," growled Roper irritably.
"No wine left. 4 whiskers and sodas, please, miss," said Fulkerson.
"He, he," giggled De Castro. "You do come to the point quickly, Bertie."
"Jawing is dry work," drawled Fulkerson, "and some people I could name seem to have lost their tempers. Why was Nico in such a rat? He looked as if he wanted to lick somebody." Meanwhile Smythe led Jays along a corridor and turned the handle of a door cunningly concealed in a mass of white and gold moulding.
"Here you are,"
he said, switching on the electric lights.
"Right at my desk. While you're about it, shall I ring up the coupe people?"
"It's awfully good of you," said Jays. Smythe busied himself at the telephone, but his gaze dwelt on the face of the man seated at the table. In stature he was fully as tall as Jays, though he lacked the physical development of drill and an open-air life. His hair might have been grey, had it been permitted to follow its natural bent, but his neatly trimmed Van Dyke beard was still silky in texture and light brown in colour. The instincts of the older crop were checked, though not so obtrusively as to attract attention. For the rest, he was a good-looking person, with a nose inclining to length and thinness, and long practice had given him the most amiable and non-committal smile in London. By the time the brougham was arranged for, 11:15, to ask for Captain Jays at the stage door of the Pandora Theatre, the note was finished. "I am very much obliged," began Jays, standing up.
"I'll send that round in a few minutes. Miss Paradale is off soon after the curtain rises," said Smythe pleasantly. "By the way, you must be an old friend of hers?"
"Yes. Oh, yes, as age goes in friendship with a girl under 20.
"Is she so young? Well, she looks it. She has a career before her, Captain Jays. I hope you don't mind me saying it, but it would be a pity if anything interfered with her prospects in the near future. Marriage, for instance, would be a real calamity, not only to the play-going public, but to herself." If Carlton Smythe had taken part in his own productions, he could never have avoided being cast for a kind, good husband or a genial uncle. His smooth voice and sympathetic smile took away any semblance of sting or even of undue inquisitiveness from such a remark as that which he had just uttered. Jays, to his own subsequent surprise, did not resent it in the slightest degree. "Much as I admire your theatre, Mr. Smythe," he said, "I can hardly agree with you that Lily, Miss Paradale, might not be happier if she abandoned it." "You're mistaken, dear boy, quite mistaken, I assure you. If we were discussing women generally, I would agree with you to the utmost, but it is otherwise with the born actress, especially when she has, so to speak, been reared in the profession. To deny Miss Paradale the exercise of her art, now that she has shown what is in her, would be a crime, and, as some diplomat put it, worse than a crime, a blunder. Don't you see what would happen? She would always be grieving over a lost opportunity. Every time she sang a little song or mimicked some celebrity in her own home, people would say, 'Dear me, Mrs. So-and-so, I wonder you didn't go on the stage.' Or, if they knew something of her history, 'Why did you ever leave the Pandora after making such a decided hit?' Do you think that sort of thing conduces to steady running in double harness? No, sir, it doesn't. It's as bad as bearing rain, a constant source of annoyance. Mind you, I'm speaking of the artistic temperament, which doesn't find its outlet in making jam and fixing frocks for the kiddies out of paper patterns at 6pence halfpenny a time." Oddly enough, Jays experienced an unfathomable sense of satisfaction on hearing these words of wisdom from the lips of one so fully qualified to utter them. They counselled delay,
and the necessity for delay had been worrying him ever since he first formed the opinion that Lily Paradale was the one girl in the world he wanted to marry. "I'm glad I've had this chat with you," he said. "I make no secret of the fact that I mean to, that I hope to have the honour of asking Lily to be my wife one of these days, but not yet. I must see my way a little clearer. You understand, Mr. Smythe, there are difficulties for an army man, and I'm keen on making Lily happy when I do provide a home for her." Carlton Smythe's eyes twinkled, no doubt with heartfelt appreciation of such excellent sentiments. "Exactly," he said. "In a year or two you will have laid your plans. By that time Miss Paradale will have established her fame, and no matter whether she remains on the stage or leaves it, she will at least be rid of the canker of what might have been, which, like a boil, breaks out in unexpected places. Well, shall I see you to your note? The curtain is up." It occurred to Jays some months later that the astute manager of the Pandora Theatre had contrived to humbug him rather neatly. For the moment he was quite grateful to this kindly mentor, who had helped to dissipate some of his qualms. He was late in reaching his stall, and earned further unpopularity. But that did not trouble him, because his thoughts were completely absorbed by his own affairs. Indeed, Nicholas Jays was somewhat of an egoist. With him, impartial judgment meant the point of view which best suited his own ends, and now that he had seen the folly of attempting to dash to the ground the brimming cup just lifted to Lily Paradale's lips, there was a most admirable reason for postponing the crisis which an open engagement would surely bring about. Of course, the average young man in love does not reason in that cold-blooded way, but Jays was not an average young man. He was a highly efficient officer in His Majesty's service, and, although indubitably in love, he thought it wise not to sacrifice his career for the sake of a wife, just yet. He was the sort of man who might blame the girl if his calculations did not accord with the facts. He might even try to force the facts to fit in with his calculations. But the gods are merciful to mankind in one respect. They veil the future in impenetrable mists, and if Jays was content with the present outlook, the gods were content to leave him so. Lily was delayed that night. When she did at last appear through the stage door, she was accompanied by a number of girls, all talking at once. For the hour, at any rate, her friends in the profession were devoid of the least envy, and honestly rejoicing in the success of one of themselves. The goddess of fortune had smiled on Lily Paradale to-day. It might be the turn of Gabs, or Enid, or Nita, or Flo next week. Scraps of eager talk which reached the waiting Jays were illuminating.
"My dear, you should have seen Eva Shafto watching you from the prompt side. If a look could have slain—"
Obviously Eva Shafto was the leading lady.
"Oh, Eva's all right. Sir George's motor was waiting for her. Vincent was delighted. You can always tell when he's pleased, because he sticks his thumbs in his waistcoat and stands with his feet wide apart. And look here, Lil, don't be silly and take the first figure Smythe offers you. Go to a good agent. It's worth paying the I ought to hate you, but I don't, though the Baron and Smythe told him he was keeping me in mind."
This from Enid Moncrief, a willowy beauty, rather impressive in style. Lily burst through the lively crowd.
"Oh, girls, you've all been so good to me," she cried. "Ah, there's Nico. Is that Bram for me? How sweet of you. Don't forget Katanes at 1, everybody. Nico." "I've made my half-dozen 14. Do you mind just this once? Then, with your 6, will be a score, a musical score. Girls, I'm not so mad as I look if I can rap out a new wheeze. Goodbye. I can't kiss you all, and my poor face is sticky with tears."
Jays was about to follow her into the brougham when the stage door attendant rushed out. He was carrying a lustrous bouquet of red and white carnations. "Beg pardon, miss," he said. "I was nearly forgetting this. Miss Shafto left it for you." A card pinned to a broad white ribbon bore the words, With love and hearty congratulations from Eva Shafto. How kind, how very kind, the girl almost sobbed. Gabs, you cat, she shrilled suddenly. Take back what you said about Eva Shafto. She sent me that ducky bouquet that was handed up to her after Star of Even tonight. Ass, growled Jays to himself. He had forgotten to provide some flowers on this, her great night. Were it not for the leading lady's graceful thought, Lily would have gone home lacking the tiniest spray of the actress's laurel. In Wellington Street, Jays extended a lover-like arm, meaning to encircle the girl's waist. With a deft movement she eluded him. "Not tonight, Nico," she said. "Please don't touch me tonight. Everybody in the theatre embraced me till I wanted to scream." "Everybody?" "Well, the everybody of my small world." "Men as well as women, I suppose?" In a savage tone that made her laugh hysterically. Then she began to talk strangely, wildly, with a curiously pathetic break in her voice at times. "Shocking, wasn't it? But they meant well, the dears, and I hadn't the heart to say, 'Mind the paint, don't be angry, Nico. I shall hold you all the dearer if you don't come any nearer.' There, you see, I'm still all of a whirl. I know I shall feel awful tomorrow if the people applaud me when I begin to sing my song. But didn't it go beautifully? And you were shouting with the best of them. I actually heard your voice, even in that din. Nico, shall I wake up in the morning and find that it was all a dream, and that poor Ma and I must still keep on paying 12 shillings a week for apartments in the Kennington Park Road? Apartments with use of kitchen and lock-up coal cellar and pop a penny in the slot when the gas goes out? Oh my! Is that dingy prospect really vanishing out of our lives? Shall I earn a decent salary and free my mother from the drudgery of cooking and scrubbing and mending? Shall I be able to buy her nice clothes? Poor thing, she picked up a cheap dress last October. It would be warm for the winter, she said, and only the other day she told me that summer was getting on so fast that she thought she would make her frock hold out till next spring. Good God, Nico, the blue serge I'm wearing cost her this year's dress because she can manage, whereas I have to be decently clothed. Do you know the meaning of the word manage? You have taught me how to conjugate verbs, but that is a verb which is found only in the textbooks of the poor. I have managed. Thou shalt manage. He or she might, could, or should manage on 35 bob a week and pay your own fares." Jays was suddenly gripped by a new emotion. Not being wholly a fool, he devoted himself to soothing her, to praising unstintingly, to promising fame and fortune. He told her of the nice things said by Carlton Smythe, by De Castro, by strangers in the audience, and when he bade her good night, he simply pressed her hand and promised to call next day in good time for the luncheon party. He retired to rest rather more easy in mind. When all was said and done, it was more seemly that he should marry a celebrity than a mere chorus girl, and any man would prefer that the woman he loved should be raised out of the penury which constitutes London's gravest offence against its young and pretty girls. Then he fell asleep, and dreamed that Bertie Fulkerson had stabbed Sam de Castro with a large carving knife, giving as a reason that he was tired of Sam's white waistcoats. The lunch at Catani's went off gaily, though it travelled on lines not contemplated by the giver of the feast. Lily Paradal, of course, was its bright particular star, and Captain Nicholas Jays had the honour of paying the bill, but his part in the entertainment threatened to stop there. It was essentially a theatrical and bohemian gathering, and if Jays had lived 20 years in the Quartier Latin, it may be doubted whether on the 20th anniversary he would have footed it in the right spirit at the Cat's Arts Ball. Lily, brimming over with delight, praised the charming flowers which decked the table, and Sam de Castro commented on the excellence of the wine, but Jays, strive as he might, and did, felt that he was in this company and not of it, Once toward the close of the feast he struck in valiantly. "Dash it all!" he cried. "Except Lil and Lal Roper, all of you call me Captain Jays. I won't stand it. My name is Nico, and please don't forget it. Sorry, Bertie, I omitted you, but you are at the other end of the table. And you too, Baron, even if you do call me Niggo. Enid, here's to that song Carlton Smythe has in mind for you. Vincent, may you write it, and a jolly one too." "Waiter," cried Fulkerson, "fill 2 glasses. I have a couple of toasts to honour." A laugh went around. Under cover of it, von Rettenmeier whispered to Enid Moncrief, "The wet blanket is steaming."
"Who is a wet blanket, and why should it steam, and what on earth are you gassing about?" demanded the young lady.
"Mein Liebe, I'm talking in parables."
"You're talking nonsense, if you ask me, Nico, then. When did our worthy manager say anything about a new song for me, or even an old one for that matter?"
"Ah, I mustn't reveal the secrets of the treasure house. A man may smile and be a villain, but if Enid smiles, even a managerial ogre must yield."
That was his best effort. Carlton Smythe, not being a villain, smiled seraphically, and the ruthless Vincent Bland interfered by remarking that there was a call for 3 o'clock, and it was now 2:45. That night Mrs. Upjohn came to the theatre to hear her daughter's song, so that there were 3 in the homeward-bound cab. On this occasion Jays had paid pounds for the right sort of bouquet, which was handed over the footlights with fitting ceremony by the conductor. But, to Jay's annoyance, there were 4 others, 1 from the company, 3 from unknown admirers. Next morning he received a note per boy messenger.
"Dear Nico," it ran, "I'm awfully sorry, but I can't meet you today. Too bad, isn't it, when you are off to the Curragh this afternoon? But CS and VB have been putting their heads together, and my part is to be made more of, and my song is transferred to the 2nd act, and I'm in the theatre now, hard at work. There are people, you know, who dine late, and bookstalls just to see one item, and the management think this may happen in my case. Flattering, but a nuisance, because rehearsal has started early and will end late. I hear that the libraries were getting anxious, so Carlton Smythe had to consider them. Never mind, dear, I write often, and the days will fly until you come again to dear old London town. Yours ever, Lil."
Fly, would they? Jays thought they would drag most infernally. Not another hour's leave was possible until the close of the autumn manoeuvres. He had to plead urgent private affairs before his colonel would listen to an application for the brief respite now ended. He had been on the point of strolling out, but a fine morning had lost its attraction, and he sauntered into the club smoking-room. There he picked up a newspaper, and within a minute was glowering angrily at a paragraph in a column headed "Notes and News." "Yesterday," he read, "Captain Jays of the North Devons, who is relaxing in town after the strenuous life of the Curragh, entertained a party of friends to luncheon at Catani's restaurant, 459 Strand. Though the majority of the guests hailed from the Pandora Theatre, society was represented by Mr. Bertie Fulkerson, diplomacy by Baron von Rettenmeier of the German Embassy, the arts by Mr. Samuel de Castro, and the Stock Exchange by Mr. Lionel Roper. The diva of the function, moreover, was Miss Lily Paradell, who is already known to the smart set as the mind-the-paint girl of the Pandora. Luigi catered in his inimitable way, and the fun was fast and furious, while not a few of the regular patrons of the restaurant were highly interested in learning that the new star was shining in their midst, and in broad daylight, which went to prove that her extraordinary attractiveness on the stage is by no means dependent on artifice," and so on, in excellent journalese. The well-meaning scribe might have had no more sinister intent than to do a good turn both to Catani's and to Lily Paradal, but Jays was still fuming over the exposé, for he regarded it as nothing less, while his luggage was being piled on a hansom. "Hello, Jays," said a man who had just emerged from the club and was standing on the top step of the entrance. "Back to the army again?" "Yes." "Let me see. You're quartered at the Curragh, aren't you?" "Yes." "You have my condolences. Beastly hull, all grass and furze. Still, I've had some fairly decent intervals there, ripping snipe shooting within a few hours, and the racing isn't half bad. Have you hunted with the Kildare?" "No." "You're bally monosyllabic this morning, Nico. What's wrong? Got the hump?" "Something of the sort. Goodbye, Euston. Cabby!" End of chapter 3.
Chapter 4 of the Mind the Paint Girl. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nathan Fair. The Mind the Paint Girl by Lewis Tracy. Chapter 4. The Descent. Jays never afterwards forgot that drive through London. Shaftesbury Avenue was up, so the cabman, with the curious liking of his tribe for byways in preference to main thoroughfares, threaded the mean streets of Soho and East Marylebone. Somehow this ignoble retreat through the slums of London did not offer a happy augury for the future. It looked to Jays as though he were passing from the glitter and brightness of metropolitan life into depths at once sordid and depressing. It did not help to cheer his gloom when, at a corner of Tottenham Court Road, he caught sight of a newspaper placard bearing a legend of singular personal interest. Staring black type announced that the evening something or other contained a portrait and biography of the Mind the Paint Girl at the Pandora. On the impulse of the moment, he stopped the cab and bought a copy of the paper. Sure enough, a very fair picture of Lily Paradal appeared on an inner page, and the printed details of her life were far more flattering than was warranted by the facts. Evidently the department which dealt with the advertising literature of the Pandora Theatre had prepared this glowing memoir, and, indeed, Jays fancied he could trace the same skilled hand that had aroused his ire by the paragraph in one of the morning journals. This discovery, or guess, as it might be described more accurately, gave him time to think. He had supposed that the reference to the complimentary luncheon at Catani's was a kindly puff, emanating from some journalist who frequented the restaurant, but now he had reason to suspect that the theatre's press agent was embarking on a serious campaign in behalf of its latest celebrity. Each line of the laudatory notice bore witness to an intimate knowledge of Lily's career, a knowledge which suppressed or distorted her professional experiences until they were made to appear part of a settled plan that had resulted in her triumphant debut as the Mind the Paint Girl at the Pandora. Even the account of her birth and upbringing was trimmed to suit the writer's intent. She was described as the only daughter of a successful merchant who had been widely known and esteemed in the Battersea district until his lamented death some years earlier. Jays knew the truth. He knew that a faded little man had worked and striven until he was pushed out of a small shop by competition, and finally driven out of life itself, one among the thousands of unrecorded failures which London produces with such callous indifference. Faugh! His strong hands crushed the newspaper into a ball, and he threw it into the roadway. One day, 16 months later, the senior major of the North Devons, questioned on the point by a perplexed colonel, admitted that Captain Jays seemed to be losing grip. About the same period, the subalterns of the battalion, more brutally juvenile in the frankness of their judgment, had arrived at the conclusion that Jays was a slacker. There was a dreadful truth about both verdicts, and none knew it better than Nico Jays himself. He had visited London 4 times during that weary year, and on each occasion had returned to the regiment less eager to advance in his profession, and more disconsolate because of the ever-widening gap between Lily Paradal's meteoric rise in public favor and his own apparent anchorage in a backwater of routine. It was not true, of course, that he was being overlooked by the authorities. It was not true that he had no career to look forward to. In his saner moments he realized that hard work and faithful devotion to duty would surely earn promotion, more rapidly in his case than was attainable by thousands of other officers equally keen, equally well qualified for better things, but lacking the interest he could command. Had he never met Lily Paradell, he would unquestionably have been happy and content, but her letters, each glowing eulogium in the press, every scrap of gossip retailed by the latest arrival from London, strengthened the conviction that she was drifting away from him, that while he remained in the army it was hopeless to think of marrying her. At last the crash came. The battalion figured among the Indian reliefs for the next trooping season. Jays, like every other man in the regiment, obtained short leave in his turn, and raced off to London. It must be now or never for him with Lily Paradell. She must either abandon the stage, marry him, and drop into the conventional round of the Memsahib, who gives more to the empire than her stay-at-home sister dreams of, or he must weigh in the scales an infatuation as opposed to a career. He knew exactly what travail and argument and bitter family broils lay ahead. Rumor had been busy, even in quiet Huntingdon, and the mother had written to her soldier son, imploring him to cut loose from a connection which could not be other than harmful. "I say nothing as to the personal qualities or charm of Miss Paradell," she wrote. "She must be both clever and fascinating, or she could never have made so great an impression on the play-going public of London. But she and her like should marry in their own class. Its members should not think of allying themselves with the men of our county aristocracy, who lead our public services almost by right of birth, and who, in their turn, should rear sons and daughters fitted to carry the flag to the far lands. Such girls do not make good mothers. In that sense, if in no other, they are a menace to society." Here, then, was a solid rock of prejudice awaiting him at Huntingdon. Bob, his eldest brother, took a different line, but one equally emphatic. The newspaper account of the festivity at Catani's had found its way to distant Bulawayo, being copied and recopied until it appeared in a small local sheet months after the original publication in London, when, oddly enough, brother Bob had missed seeing it. "Dear Nico," he wrote, "judging from the enclosed cutting, you seem to have been going it, date uncertain, but details convincing. Chuck it, dear boy. Give it the everlasting shove. Our crowd looks rather out of place in such gatherings. I want to see your name in dispatches, not in the tittle-tattle of the coulisses. I'm going strong out here, and hope to have a run home next year. It'll be rather rotten if I miss you, but a fellow in the Manchesters told me the other day that your battalion was due in India next cold weather. Of course, if that's so, we'll grumble and make the best of it. There is always a Jay's somewhere on the frontier." Sound, honest counsel, which wrung the withers of the recipient, nor was the situation improved on the morning the letter arrived by the fact that his colonel sent for Jays and complained about the low musketry average attained by his company. "It is the worst in the battalion, and used to be the best," he said. "Why is that? I always regarded you as my most promising officer in musketry instruction. A year ago you were a keen soldier, thorough in every respect, and particularly so on the range. What has happened? Can I help you in any way?" The colonel's tone was kindly, even if the words were uncompromising. Jays muttered miserably that he had been bothered by personal matters, but would endeavor to effect an improvement when the regiment went to India. He hated to admit, even to himself, that he was acting foolishly. Yet it was borne in on him that the policy of drift was a complete failure, so he came to London in a mood to hurl thunderbolts and defy lightning. The Duchess of Brixton was still running merrily. Eva Shafto had married her baronet, and Lily Paradell was appearing in the title role. The song that made her famous had been dropped long ago, but its catchy refrain, and the still more catchy nickname it had conferred, would never be forgotten by her generation. To all London she was still the mind-the-paint girl. The curious appellation lent her a sort of protective aura. She was impulsive, good-hearted, lively, and outspoken as ever, but no man dared press acquaintance to the bounds of flirtation. Her profession, and especially the place she filled in it, might have been expected to expose her to the malice of the disappointed and the innuendo of scandalmongers, but never a word was breathed against her. Perhaps the nebulous attachment between Jays and herself accounted for some part of this good repute. Perhaps the fact that her mother was nominally mistress of the pretty house in Bloomsbury meant something. but the characteristics which that amazing song attributed to her stilled the tongue of gossip. She was wealthy as wealth goes on the stage. Her salary was magnificent, and she was worth every penny of it to the theatre. Then she had a stanch backer in Lionel Roper, a vastly different person on the floor of the Stock Exchange from the dapper little man who cavorted around the foyer of the Pandora, and entertained bevies of lissom beauties to supper at the Savoy. He made money for her in speculations which were under his own control, and she spent that portion of her income right royally. Her kindness was noteworthy, even in the annals of the most charitable of professions. Her purse was always open to a needy friend. It was enough for Lily Paradell to hear that some brother or sister mummer was in want, and she not only relieved temporary necessities, but, if the sufferer was not quite hopeless in a business sense, went out of her way to cajole managers into finding employment. Of course, her matrimonial prospects were eagerly canvassed by her friends. Those who knew about Nick O'Jays shook their heads over what they called Lily's madness, while the larger circle, recking little of the claims of some impecunious army man, vowed that their idol ought to marry a duke. So Jays was coming into a hornet's nest when he stepped from the Irish mail at Euston in the small hours of an October morning, and was rattled boldly to fate and his club in an antiquated four-wheeler. He had announced his arrival by letter, and a telegram bidding him come to lunch awaited him. He knew what that meant, a noisy meal shared with anyone who happened to drop in, and people were always dropping in on the Upjohn menage. 3 or 4 girls from the theatre would certainly be present. They would chatter incessantly until someone remembered an appointment with a dressmaker, followed by another for tea at Rumpelmeyer's, after which Lily must rest before going to the theatre. When the show was over, 10 to 1 there would be a supper at a restaurant or in somebody's rooms, perhaps an at-home or a dance, and most certainly no shred of opportunity for a quiet word with Lily. So, being a masterful person, he sent her a note after breakfast, saying that he would be delighted to stay for lunch, but must have a talk earlier, and purposed calling at noon or a few minutes before. He hoped she would reserve an unoccupied half-hour, and remained, yours ever, Nico. Punctually at 11:45, he alighted from a taxi at the door of a spacious house, lavishly decorated with well-filled window-boxes. He was admitted by a supercilious parlour-maid, whose haughty demeanour did not abate one jot at sight of a privileged visitor. "Mrs. Upjohn is not quite well this morning," she announced, "and Miss Paradell is out, but she left word that when you called you were to be shown into the drawing-room, and she would be home almost immediately." "Do you know where Miss Paradell has gone?" inquired Jays severely. He thought Gladys was detestable, and wondered why either Mrs. Upjohn or Lily endured her airs and graces. If he had not been a man who took himself too seriously, he would have been amused at the girl, an excellent servant, really, but far more unapproachable than her employers. "Miss Paradell is at the photographer's," was the reply, in a frosty tone, which implied that the lady in question was spending her time better and more profitably than by waiting at home to oblige Captain Jays. Momentarily quelled, the visitor entered the drawing-room and sat down, whereupon Gladys sailed out with a swish of starched linen. Jays had not been in the room before, since Lily had only recently taken this comfortable Bloomsbury house, giving up a cozy flat situated in the same quarter. He glanced around now with a curiosity that was almost furtive in its close observation. The apartment stirred up other memories. By contrast with the dingy folding-door suite in the Kennington Park Road, it was almost palatial. If anything, the decoration and furniture were too elaborate. The walls were papered to represent large clusters of white and purple lilac. The chairs and no fewer than 3 settees were covered with a chintz of similar pattern, and the curtains, carpet, and lampshades corresponded with meticulous accuracy. A conservatory, partly visible, and of the kind which a certain style of London house often has over the portico, was plentifully stocked with flowers, and hung with a velarium and green sun-blinds. A grand piano heaped with music, and a writing-table carrying a telephone, gave evidence that the room was in daily and nightly use. The pictures were oddments, oil paintings, water-colors, and prints being mixed without the least regard to harmonizing with each other. They were not crude. Lily's many visits to art galleries had at least saved her from the Christmas annual pot-boiler, but it was patent that her art trophies had been picked up as fancy dictated and hung promptly in the first position that offered. A heap of correspondence on the writing table proved that the girl retained no secrets from her household. Among the letters Jays saw his own, sent from the Curragh 2 days previously. That pile of open letters, nearly all from people whose names were unknown to him, evoked a feeling of resentment. Not for the first time in his relations with Lily Paradell was he conscious of being almost an intruder. That was bad enough. The suspicion of its truth invariably annoyed him, but his temper was stirred to annoyance by the entrance of Gladys with a message. "Mrs. Upjohn sends her compliments," she said, "and regrets she is unable to come down before luncheon. She is still indisposed." Jays laughed angrily. "Is that what Mrs. Upjohn said?" he exploded. "Words to that effect, sir," said the superior parlour-maid, and she rustled out more noisily than before, leaving Jays to realize that he was behaving like an impertinent footman. Luckily, he had not long to wait, for he was beginning to understand that any man may have nerves. He had crossed the room and was looking out into one corner of a small square, when a smart landaulet automobile drew up in front of the door, and Lily appeared. Her gown and her hat were in the fashion of the moment, but without any exaggeration. Her good taste invariably demanded restful colors, and she was always ready to subtract a few inches from the diameter of a hat and add them to the length and circumference of a short skirt. But the veriest novice in the mysteries of woman's dress could see that her clothes were costly. Jays understood without being told that a quarter's pay would not meet the bills for Lily Paradell's simple morning outfit. But that reflection did not disturb him. It was only reasonable that the leading lady of the Pandora Theatre should be well and expensively attired. His heart throbbed now because of a new conceit. Lily Paradell, descending from her motor, bore an absurdly close resemblance to the young Marchioness of Kingston, whom he had received with almost royal honors at a recent prize-giving function in Ireland. Of the two, the actress carried herself the more daintily, and was unquestionably better dressed. He gulped back a sigh. Lily had caught sight of him the instant she stood on the pavement. She smiled delightedly, waved a hand, and he could read the movement of her lips, though he could not hear her voice through the double windows. "Ah, there you are," she was saying, cheerful and friendly as ever. In a few seconds she was in the room. Flinging aside a parcel and an ermine muff, she threw her arms around him and kissed him. There was a candid camaraderie in the embrace which might have meant everything or nothing. But Jays was unversed in feminine subtleties, and the touch of her cool red lips thrilled him to the core, while the sweet fragrance of her was intoxicating. She seemed to be almost surprised when he would have held her close. Gently extricating herself, she laughed. "It's good to see you again, Nico," she said. "What fair wind has wafted you from Ireland? I was not expecting you till Christmas." Jays, stupid man, deemed it best to take the plunge at once. "You remember I told you that the battalion might be sent to India this cold weather?" "Yes." She turned to pick up the fallen muff. "Well, we're under orders. We sail in the Crocodile 4 weeks from today." "Oh, Nico!" She raised a scared face to his, and her air of alarm was somehow gratifying. "You need not look so frightened," he laughed. "One would think I said Siberia or some other ungodly hole from which people never come back. India's all right, a ripping place, especially for women." "But, Nico, how long will you be there?" 16 years, if you mean the battalion. If you mean me, it depends on you." "On me?" She had guessed his errand, and did not flinch from its discussion, though Jays attributed the sudden pain in her eyes to an unforeseen announcement. "Sorry, dear, if I seem to have blurted out my news, but I'm so afraid that Jimmy Birch or Gabs Cato may be rushing in at any moment that I must cover the ground quickly." He came nearer, put both hands on her shoulders, and looked her squarely in the eyes. "It has come to this, Lil," he went on, speaking with a slow gravity that was compelling in its intensity. "You must come with me, or else I chuck the army. I must be near you. I can't live without you. Which is it to be? We get married and go to India, or—" "Or what, Nico?" "I don't know, dear. I don't know." There were a great many things he did not know. and one of them was that Lily Paradell had to summon all her strength of will to avoid bursting into tears without further ado. With a splendid fortitude, she called to her aid a thoughtful and businesslike expression which was far from answering to her real feelings. Lifting his hands from her shoulders, she nodded towards a chair. "Let's sit down, Nico, and talk this over." He obeyed her, but, heroic in his egotism, floundered blindly along the track he had marked out. "I have tried to hint at this development each time we met during the past year," he said. "This is the first time you've asked me to marry you, Nico," she answered gravely, seating herself at some little distance. "Well, perhaps it is, in so many words. But you knew. "I can't honestly say that you've taken me unawares, for I have given some thought to it. I've looked on marriage as one of those possibilities of the future that we all have in mind, more or less. But do you really expect me to abandon my career at its very outset?" "What about me, Lil?" he broke in, with a certain heat of expostulation. "Isn't that the only alternative you leave me?" "I'm not bidding you give up the army, Nico," she said. "No, but it amounts to the same thing. Do you think I'd be content to go away to India and leave you in London?" "Why not? Other men and women have to endure separation. Why should we escape?" "You're putting the responsibility on me," he protested, and in his frantic striving to think clearly, to pick and choose with care among the furious words jostling each other in his mind, he did not see that a girl in whose veins the red blood had the quality of quicksilver was sitting quiet as a stone. "It is you who have to decide, not I," he said thickly after a slight pause. "I have weighed the pros and cons of it, Lil, during many a long day and sleepless night. In fact, I've rather gone to pieces because of the worry. I feel, in a sort of way, that I'm demanding an unfair sacrifice on your part, but I can't go to the other side of the earth for years and leave you here. Never to see you, never to hear from you till 3 weeks after you'd posted a letter. I can't do it, Lil, and what is more, I won't." "Do you believe I wouldn't wait for you?" she murmured, stirred to compassionate regret by this agonized avowal from a man usually so self-contained. "I daren't risk it," he blurted forth. "Risk what?" "Risk losing you. Good God, Lil, do you know what love is? You are made for love, if ever any woman was. Don't you understand that the mere notion of some other man winning you is enough to drive me mad?" "Perhaps you are right, Nico. Perhaps I am selfish, but not in the way you imagine. There are others to think of. Others!" He almost snorted the word. He had not the slightest suspicion that an impartial listener might allot the burden of selfishness differently as between these two. "Yes," she sighed. "First, there's Mother. I haven't been rich very long, Nico, and I have no money saved, although I earn a fine salary, and you wouldn't want to take her to India, would you?" She hardly expected an answer, even if she did hesitate a fraction of a second, but her hearer was still busily engaged in nursing his own woes. "Then there is Carlton Smythe and the people in the show," she continued hurriedly. "We can't leave them altogether out of consideration. Carlton has counted on the run of the Duchess of Brixton lasting another 6 months. He told me that the other day, and it isn't merely vain of me to say that the piece depends wholly on me. It is simply common sense. The novelty of the music and the situations has gone long ago. The public come to see me, just because I have been well advertised. It would be horribly mean if I abandoned the theatre at a week's notice. Like you, Nico, I must say I can't do it." He rose to his feet with the air of a man whose resolution is fixed. He bent over her tenderly, breathlessly. "But you'll marry me, Lil. Say you'll marry me," he gasped. "Oh, Nico," she almost sobbed. "You make it very hard for me. You know I won't marry any other man. I don't want to marry anyone yet. But why should you give up your profession on that account? It's wrong. It's a mistake. You'll regret it some time, and then you'll blame me." The door opened. Mrs. Upjohn appeared, her matronly figure wrapped in a negligee of striking Japanese pattern. "How are you, Captain?" she cried affably. "How'd you like our new house? Classy, ain't it?" Then her glance fell on her disconsolate daughter. "Why, Lil, whatever's the matter?" she demanded. "Who's been upsetting ye?" Without waiting for a reply, she turned on Jays, and the friendliness had fled from her good-natured face. "What have you been saying to Lil?" she cried. "She was lively as a kitten when she went out this morning. A nice thing, coming here—" "Mother!" broke in the girl, bestirring herself in sheer desperation. "Please don't say another word. You're quite mistaken. Captain Jays was just telling me that he does not care to go to India with his regiment, so he's leaving the service. That's all." "And enough, too," vowed Mrs. Upjohn, still suspicious and only half appeased. "How's he going to make a living after being in the army all these years? Stick to the job you understand, your poor father used to say. Look at you, Lil. What would have happened to us if you hadn't—" Fortunately, the door was flung wide again, this time by an entrancing young lady in a directoire frock. Petite, bright-eyed, and extremely chic in style, Miss Jimmy Birch, a favorite in the Pandora and out of it, bounded into the room. "How do, everybody?" she cried. "You here again, Nico? Do you boys in the army ever do any work? It doesn't look like it. And, oh my, what's the matter with you, Lil? Been to the dentist, or just going?" "Something of the sort," said Lily. "Amuse Nico, will you, Jimmy, till I rush to my room and dab my face with eau de cologne." End of chapter 4.
Chapter 5 of The Mind the Paint Girl. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. The Mind the Paint Girl by Louis Tracy. Chapter 5 In the Depths. 24 hours after his return to London, Jays was summoned to Huntingdon. As the military euphemism puts it, he had asked to be allowed to resign his commission, and having taken the most irrevocable step, was already beginning to regret it, when an ominous message from his old home banished all other considerations. A telegram addressed to the Curragh had been re-telegraphed to his club, and the text was sufficiently alarming. "Come at once," it said. "Your mother is seriously ill. Mortimer." The sender, he knew, was his mother's medical attendant. He caught the next train from King's Cross, and astonished Dr. Mortimer by meeting him at the garden gate of Ambala, a house named after the first Indian station commanded by the late General Jays. "You here, Nico?" cried the doctor. "I didn't expect you till some time tomorrow. I was in town, and your wire followed me. My mother is better, I hope. What's wrong with her?" Dr. Mortimer hesitated. This man was a soldier, and it would be no kindness to deceive him, even for a day. Still— "Mrs. Jays is seriously ill," he began. But the other interrupted, with something of panic in face and voice. "I know that," he said. "The telegram told me as much. Man, don't say she is dead." "No, Nico, but she will not recover." Jays almost reeled. Had some evil report reached quiet Huntingdon long before he had been able to prepare the way? Did his mother know he had sent in his papers? Had she collapsed under the blow? God! Was he to go through life believing he had killed her? "You must bear up, Nico," said the kindly doctor, interpreting a son's emotion in the only possible way. "She has been ill a long time. Influenza, complicated by heart trouble. But she would not hear of your being sent for until someone happened to mention, late last night, that the North Devons were under orders for India. Then she yielded, fearing lest, even if she rallied, she might never see you again. Nico, you are just in time. It is a strange thing that you should happen to be so near. Tomorrow would have been too late." "Oh, thank heaven for that small mercy," muttered Jays, hurrying towards the house without another word. Mortimer gazed after him pityingly. "He has taken it worse than I would have imagined," he thought, though not altogether with surprise, because big stolid men of the Jays stamp often break down more completely under the stress of sudden grief than those of a more nervous temperament. He could not know the true motive inspiring that curt thanksgiving to Providence. Mrs. Jays was far beyond the stage when a lifelong acquaintance with army ways must have set her wondering how Nico came to be by her side so promptly. She smiled a welcome and feebly pressed his hands, and that was all. The mother passed away into the long night without ever a moment of real anguish caused by her soldier son. He roused himself from a stupor of grief in order to cable the disastrous tidings to Bob in Buluwayo, and to Nigel, the student of the family, now earning fame as a railway construction engineer in the Argentine. The problem presented itself. Should he tell Lily at once? The hour was rather late. She would be preparing for the theater, and the suddenness of the thing might interfere with her work. He decided with a certain grimness that the business of the Pandora Theater took precedence over his private affairs. So he wrote. Next morning came a telegram. My love and heartfelt sympathy with you in your irreparable loss. Lily. It comforted him strangely. No matter what clouds there were in his life, Lily always rang true. She could have chosen no phrase more grateful, more subtly healing. It was Lily herself speaking, tender-hearted, affectionate, impulsive Lily Paradell. His mother's will named as her executor or executors such of my sons as may happen to reside in the United Kingdom at the time of my death. The tears rose to the man's eyes when he heard the simple words. They had come from no lawyer-like mint. They were eloquent of the unswerving devotion of an Englishwoman to England. Her husband, her sons, she herself during many years, had they not gone, each and all, north and south, east and west, when duty called? Scattered from pole to pole, charting the trackless depths of ocean, the bones of our English dead mark the ever-widening bounds of empire. And who knew it better than she? During the 40 years of her life, since she became a woman, she had always been ready to die, or to suffer a loss more bitter than death in the service of her country. Yet the gods were kind to her. Her 3 sons were alive, and she herself was laid to rest by the side of her dear husband. So the black days passed, and Jayes scarce realized all that he had lost until he found himself in London once more, bereft of a mother he had loved more than he knew, and minus a profession. At first he shrank, almost with terror, from the well-meaning inquiries of friends. "Hullo, Nico," some man in the army who knew him would say. "Sorry to hear of your bad news. But why the dickens did you chuck the service?" Then, when his old battalion was hurried to the front to get licked into shape in one of Britain's little wars beyond the Indus, some heedless blatherer would condole with him. "Rotten bad luck for you, Nico, leaving the regiment before you heard of this scrap. It's not going to be a walkover. You saw that poor Montague and Lawson were nipped in a rearguard action the other day." Yes, he knew. Montague was junior major, and Lawson senior captain. Jayes would have obtained his majority 4 years ahead of the ordinary course of events. But why tell him that now? He quitted the club. Not only was this step made imperative by a rule forbidding continuous residence, but he had grown shy of meeting old brother officers. He took rooms in Jermyn Street, and flung himself headlong into the curiously mixed and cosmopolitan society which fluttered moth-like around the steady flame of the Pandora Theater. Lily Paradell began by being genuinely concerned about his future. She urged him constantly to take up a secretaryship or something. She even offered to secure valuable introductions to city men by using the good offices of Carlton Smythe or Lionel Roper. But he rejected such intermediaries. "Don't worry your pretty little head about me," he would say. "No matter what happens, I have more than enough to live on decently. And some opening must present itself soon, which will pay me better than smugging at company law in the hope of earning $150 a year. What good is that to you and me, now I ask you?" What indeed? Added to his own 600, it meant hardly as much in 12 months as Lily Paradell earned in 2. Her salary was £100 a week, and if so inclined, she could quadruple that sum during certain weeks in the season by appearing at private houses in the West End. On such occasions she was invariably urged to sing "Mind the Paint." She had dozens of better songs in her repertoire, but there was always some foreign notability or American millionaire in the company anxious to hear the Mind the Paint girl in her most famous role. So Nico Jays, the erstwhile smart soldier, developed into a kind of retriever, trained to fetch and carry, and escort his mistress when required. But he lacked some of the fine qualities of the dog. He could be ill-tempered and peevish, and would snap unexpectedly. Then Lily would flare into rebellion, and hot words would fly. And next day she would pet her dear old Nico, and soothe him into good behavior and placid servitude once more. Such a state of things could not endure. She was too high-spirited a girl, he too proud a man, to remain bound indefinitely by a tie so vague. Neither suspected it, but a crisis was approaching in their lives, and the hour of trial and real humiliation came when Robert Jays returned from South Africa. He, bluff and hardy man of the world, bronzed by the southern sun, and taught by the free companionship of the veld to judge his fellows openly and fearlessly, cast a critical eye over Nico and his surroundings, and, to use his own forcible phrasing, sized up the situation in a tick. "You're running to seed here, dear boy," he said, when the two were dining together one night soon after the elder brother's arrival in London. "What's come over you? You're not the same man I left here nearly 3 years ago. I was never more surprised in my life than when you wrote saying you had stopped following the drum. Of course, we were all horribly cut up by the dear old mater's death, and in a sense it was harder for you than for Nigel or myself. But bad as it was, that didn't account for your sudden collapse. What was it?" "What is it always, or 9 times out of 10?" asked Nico morosely. "A woman?" "Yes." "The woman?" "One doesn't go to the devil for the sex at large, Bob." Robert Jays laughed. He was dissecting an orange deliberately. "Of course, I meant the one woman with whom I have heard your name bracketed, the Mind the Paint girl." "Her correct name is Lily Paradell," said the younger man sharply. "Her stage name, yes. I have been told that her correct name is Upjohn, and that her father—" "She makes no secret of her birth or parentage," broke in Nico. "She has kept me dangling about unconscionably, I must admit. But for all that, she is the best-hearted and cheeriest and most charming woman in London." "I haven't the least doubt of it," agreed Robert instantly. "Fellows who came out from home were always raving about her. I almost regretted that business kept me so long on the wrong side of the line that I hadn't a chance of hearing her. They said she used to skip about the stage like a fairy." "My dear fellow, you are talking of ancient history. Lily Paradell does 10 times the work now that she did then. If you want to see her at her best, come with me to the Pandora Theater tomorrow evening." "Sorry, Nico, but I can't tomorrow. I am booked for Peter Chalmers' uncle. Peter is one of my partners, you know." "Well, that can stand over, but I want you to meet Lily. Tomorrow is her birthday. Other things being equal, I shall get up a little supper at Catani's after the theater, say 11:30. Chalmers is a quiet old bird, I fancy, so you'll be free at that hour. Have a taxi waiting. They take you anywhere in 10 minutes." Bob did not answer at once. He signed to a waiter to bring the coffee and cigars. "Let me understand matters fully, Nico," he said, when they were able to talk unreservedly once more. "Are you engaged to Miss Paradell?" "Yes, in a sort of a way." "But a man doesn't marry a woman in a sort of a way." "I was going to explain. Lily and I were very good friends before she made the hit that put her bang in front of the musical comedy stage. If I had married her then, all would have been well. But I was in the army, and the mater was living, and there were, or there seemed to be, 50 good reasons for delay. So like a fool, I played the waiting game." "1 minute. Did mother ever know?" "About Lily? No, not exactly, that is. She had heard something and wrote me about it, discussing marriage with an actress as a general proposition. Need I tell you what line she took?" Robert Jays was endowed with the quality of tact in which his brother was so conspicuously lacking. He evaded the direct question by putting another. "If I remember rightly," he said, "she died without knowing that you had sent in your papers." "Yes, thank the Lord." Robert nodded. He was trying to help Nico over his fences. "Sorry, but I interrupted you," he said. Lily's success changed the whole perspective. From being a chorus girl, earning a couple of guineas a week, she sprang to 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 a year. One doesn't take such kangaroo jumps on an army pay sheet. I stopped just where I was. With average luck, my princely remuneration might rise from 11 shillings 7 pence a day to 13 shillings 7 pence in 5 or 6 years, if I behaved myself, and passed the staff examination. He spoke bitterly, and Robert was content to say, "Of course, Nico, one doesn't enter the service to make money. For 6 generations there has always been a Jays with the colors." Till I made a fool of myself. "I didn't imply that. I don't even think it. Like every other human institution, the army is changing. If it demands the whole time of good men, it will have to make it worth their while. But let us keep to the one topic, this indefinite engagement of yours." "It is not indefinite. Lily will marry me when I can afford to keep her in something like the style she has won for herself." "I see. Of course, a young lady at the top of the theatrical set lives under heavy current expense. You could give her a better time on 3,000 a year than she has now on 5. In other words, you have to multiply your present income by 5. How do you purpose doing it?" Nico chuckled dryly and poured out a glass of port. "I dislike arithmetical problems after dinner," he said. "Suppose you tell me something about your Bulawayo property. Bob, I wish to goodness you had gone into the service instead of me. To look at you now, it seems the silliest sort of nonsense that anyone should have regarded you as phthisical." "There's a lot of silly things in the world which have the unfortunate drawback of being true. The dry air of the veldt has done wonders for me, but if I were to remain here during one cold, raw, damp spring, I should be barking again. But no jibbing, Nico. Let's get this heart-to-heart talk finished now. I'm not a marrying man, for the best of reasons. Of course, if my health continues to improve, I may develop the Ammococcus microbe some fine day. But without positive experience, I've formed a theory on the point. If I loved a girl and she loved me, I'd expect her to come along to Bulawayo or any other old place." "And give up 5,000 a year that she was making off her own bat?" Robert blew a big ring of smoke into the air and shot a number of smaller rings through it. "It's a deuce of a lot of money," he mused aloud. "I fancy it can't last many years, and as I've said before, it really doesn't mean the same amount earned by a man as the head of a household. Let us balance the ledger. On the one side you have the theater, day in and day out, with a few hours of giddy whirl strictly within the 4-mile radius. Artificial, every minute of life. Motor, dresses, hotel bills, jewelry, top rates for every mortal thing. Not much left out of the 5,000. On the other side, the hypothetical Mrs. Jays would live a free, unfettered, delightful life in Rhodesia. She'd move in good society, a damn sight better than she meets in London. Oh, I know what I'm talking about. Our people out there are the right sort, not the effeminate dandies and painted dolls who form the majority of any crowd you mix with in town. Dash it all, Nico, if the girl's heart is sound and her brain clear, she won't keep a man hanging after her here when happiness and a home are waiting for her out there." Robert Jays had made, for him, 2 rather long speeches, but he had said what he meant to say, while leaving unsaid those things which might hurt and rankle. So in that respect his remarks were a model of good oratory. Nico was more deeply moved than he cared to show. He remained silent for fully a minute. When he spoke, it was not to controvert his brother's philosophy, but to thank him. "You're a decent chap, Bob," he said, "but that's nothing new. You are never anything else. Are you offering me a job on your farm?" "Yes. Peter and I, and Jim Dalby, of course, had a long jaw before I sailed. We want someone we can trust to act as our agent. We'd put you in the way of it, and one or other of us would be on the spot for a year or more. And in the meantime we'd be striking out in other directions. There ain't millions in farming or trading, but there's a glorious life, and a comfortable one, and enough to provide for the missus and the kids when the rain falls. What do you say to it? You don't want me to decide at once? No, there's no special hurry. You can't expect any girl to make up her mind on such an important matter in less time than she'd take to choose a summer hat. You see, I'm allowing for the fact that you mean to consult Miss Paradell. Mind you, I'd be delighted if she'd marry you and come out. She must be a jolly decent sort of girl, if 1/4 of what I've heard of her is correct. But there must be no shirking the issue, Nico. I hate to see you wasting the best years of your life in a way that's not, well, I must put it frankly, that's not creditable to you or to any of us, either those who are left or those who have gone. A third long speech, but this time it held a barbed shaft that was not blunted because of a fraternal anxiety to come to the rescue. The younger man flushed deeply. He felt the thrust, and his incurable self-love was wounded. You haven't quite realized the difficulties that beset me, he muttered. Somehow it sounds childish for a grown man to plead an infatuation as an excuse. But it exists, so why try to ignore it? And there is one element in the situation which has escaped you. I could have married Lily Paradell 3 years ago and have remained in the army. Suppose I had. What a hullabaloo there would have been in the family. Great Scott! It would have caused almost as much heartburning as if I had embezzled the canteen funds. And far more, I do honestly believe, than if I had done a bunk with the colonel's wife. Robert laughed cheerfully. He had contrived to put his point of view unmistakably before his stiff-necked brother, and that would suffice. Conditions change as the years roll on, he said. Our dear old dad remembered the time when his regiment boasted the proud possession of a bottle-nosed major who could drink any officer in the British Army under the table. Nowadays, that sort of major doesn't exist, in a mess at any rate. Nico felt that Bob had shelved the fresh discussion he was raising, and shelved it rather skillfully, too. We haven't settled about tomorrow night, he said. If I arrange that party, will you come? Delighted. Any possibility of an understanding being reached between you and the lady in the interim? Yes, there's a chance. I'll be fetching her from the theater tonight. When she's tired and inclined to be snappy, I'll go bail. Not a word of it tonight, Nico, unless you want to fail at the first pop out of the box. Well then, tomorrow afternoon, though being her birthday, she'll be having lots of callers. Don't press, dear boy. Colts on the curb, but fillies on the snaffle isn't half a bad rule. But should you have mentioned South Africa for the honeymoon, give me the office, that's all. And I'll shape my talk according. Which is bad grammar, but I hate adverbs, don't you? They ought to be kept for flappers' academies only. Nico saw the drift of his brother's outspoken diplomacy. The day of shuffling was past. It must be now or never for the loose end of the Jays family. He laid his plans cautiously, and was so thoughtful during the homeward drive from the Pandora that Lily chaffed him about it. You remind me of Vincent Bland after tea, she said. Why after tea particularly, he asked. Because by that time he knows what has won the big race, and is bothering his brains to account for the strange loss of form in the horse he backed. He bets rather a lot, doesn't he? Went on Jays, feeling that the conversation was following a safe line. Far too much, and he has promised me to give it up I don't know how often. Oh, Nico, I'm glad you haven't got that failing. It would worry me dreadfully if you took to betting. Jays smiled, though not because of an unctuous self-righteousness. He could not help thinking that next day he was taking an outside chance, which would have appalled even the sporting Vincent Bland, in proposing that the mind-the-paint girl should fly from London to the wilds of Rhodesia merely to oblige him, Nico Jays. But vous l'avez voulu, Georges Dandin, vous l'avez voulu. And Jays was just the kind of man who would blame anybody other than himself if the experiment went wrong. 18 months earlier, Lily had summed him up accurately with one lightning-clear glimpse of a woman's intuition. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6 of The Mind the Paint Girl. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. The Mind the Paint Girl by Louis Tracy. Chapter 6. The Plot. When he chose Lily Paradell's birthday as the day on which he would put his fortunes to the test, Nico Jays, as it happened, was running counter to the designs of several other people, few of whom were his friends, while some, if not avowed enemies, at least made common cause against his self-assertive arrogance where Lily Paradell was concerned. Set stubbornly on his own purpose, he was superbly indifferent to the thoughts and feelings of either friend or foe. In pursuance of a settled plan, he resolved to drop in on the Upjohn household about tea time. The place would surely be crowded with Lily's friends, theatrical and otherwise, but Mrs. Upjohn would rout them when the hour came for Lily to eat a slight meal and to rest before going to the theater. He counted then on securing an uninterrupted tete-a-tete. It was not wholly surprising that Jays should regard an extraordinary enterprise with a degree of hopefulness. A strong-minded man, dominated by what W.S. Gilbert so happily described as hard-boiled egotism, he would naturally thrust his own interests into the foremost place. He accepted most thoroughly Shakespeare's cheering dictum that there is a tide in the affairs of men which, taken at the flood, leads on to fortune. And whatever the outcome might be, it was unquestionable that an irresistible tide was running in Nico Jay's life at that moment. In fact, a powerful adverse current was making its influence felt a good hour or more before the time he had fixed upon for the visit to Bloomsbury. The earliest caller admitted by the superior parlor maid was a tall, immaculately dressed young man, whose bearing and appearance suggested the soldier. Indeed, a well-informed critic might have reasoned more closely and detected a guardsman. He was a good-looking youngster, about 25 years of age, and his manner held that charming sense of deference to the opposite sex which wins instant approval, whether from parlor maid or countess. Even the frigid Gladys smiled almost affably. "No, my lord, Miss Paradell is not at home," she said, "but she will be here soon, and I was told to ask any friends who came to wait in the drawing-room." Lord Farncombe promptly accepted this general invitation. Rather contrary to his expectation, he found himself alone in the drawing-room. Gloves, hat, and cane in hand, he seated himself in an armchair in the middle of the room and glanced round. On pedestals, on a console table, on a china cabinet, on one of the settees, on the tea table, even upon the floor, stood huge baskets of flowers and other handsome floral devices in various forms, each with a card attached. Lying higgledy-piggledy on the writing table were a heap of small packages, mainly jewelry cases, some opened and some closed, and a litter of paper and string. Every package and case had its accompanying card or letter. Lily Paradell was popular among friends whom she could reckon by the score, and few of them had forgotten the significance of the date. Lord Farncombe's gaze rested with approval on one particularly effective bouquet, composed exclusively of Frau Karl-Druschki and La France roses, to which, possibly because of its size and beauty, a special place of prominence on the piano had been accorded. At last, a somewhat striking portrait of Lily Paradell herself, not in one of her stage characters, but severe in its simplicity, caught his eye. He was rising to examine it more closely when the door was opened, and Lionel Roper entered. The stockbroker, one of those tubby, cheerful, bald-headed little men who seem never to grow older, greeted the young guardsman cordially. "Hullo!" he cried. "I'm in luck at last. Just the chap I'm hunting for. How do you do, Lord Farncombe? How do you do?" Farncombe shook hands, and managed to conceal any surprise he may have felt, either because of Roper's enthusiasm or of the very striking and gorgeous waistcoat that Uncle Lal was wearing. Moreover, Gladys came to his aid. Having shown Mr. Roper into the room, she remained in the doorway and watched his effusiveness with her habitually scornful air. "I'll tell Mrs. Upjohn you're here," she said. "Oh, ta!" replied Roper without looking at her, and Gladys disappeared. "Phew! It's hot," he went on, vigorously mopping his domed forehead. "Miss Paradell is out," said Farncombe. Roper nodded and took off his gloves. Evidently he was quite at home here. "She won't be long, I dare say," he commented, beaming around the room with marked appreciation of its unusual contents. "I've brought her a few flowers," said Farncombe, rather at a loss to maintain the conversation. "Oh, have you?" said Roper. "I've sent her a trifle of jewelry." The guardsman glanced at the writing table. "She seems to have received quite a lot of jewelry," he said. "Yes, by Jove, doesn't she? Ah, there's my brooch!" And Roper bustled across to the table to pick up one of the cases and gloat over it. Farncombe came a little nearer. "I didn't consider I'd a right to offer her anything but flowers on so slight an acquaintance," he explained modestly. Roper grinned acceptance of such an excellent sentiment. "Exactly. But I'm an old friend, you know. Plenty of time for a youngster like you. Perhaps by her next birthday." "I hope so." The two smiled at each other, and Roper read something in the younger man's face which encouraged him to unfold the scheme he had in mind. He approached Farncombe closely and took hold of the lapel of his coat. "Look here," he said confidentially. "Are you doing anything tonight?" I shall be at the theater, of course." "Oh, we shall all be at the theater to shout many happy returns and kick up a general shindy. Later, I mean, after the show. Are you free?" "There is nothing that I can't get out of," said Farncombe eagerly. "Good. Well, you see, it's this way. Smythe is giving Lily a bit of a supper in the foyer, with a dance on the stage to follow. Quite a sociable affair. About 25 people all told. Will you come?" "If Mr. Smythe is kind enough to ask me," began Farncombe. "He does ask you through me," said the impetuous Roper. "He's left all the arrangements to me and Maury Cooling. Carlton never did anything in his life. I egged him on to this. I've been sweating at it since 11 o'clock. I haven't been near the city, not near it. There'll be a hue and cry out for me soon from my office. Well?" There was no need to ask the young officer whether or not the invitation was agreeable to him. His eyes glowed, and he beamed down on the little stockbroker as though the latter had just conferred on him the dearest wish of his heart. "I shall be delighted," he said, and there was no doubting the genuineness of the conventional phrase on this occasion. "Splendid," said Roper, with a self-satisfied air. "I've been trying to get on to you all day. I've called twice at your club and at St. James Place." "Sorry you've had so much trouble." Roper bounced down onto the settee in front of the writing table and applied his handkerchief again vigorously. Small and mercurial, he was singularly lively in his actions, and did everything with a zest, whether it was heading a daring attack by the bulls or taking a pretty girl into supper. "There'll be the Baron," he said confidentially, "Sam de Castro, Bertie Fulkerson, Stu Heneage, Jerry Grimwood, Colonel and Mrs. Stidolph. You know the Stidolphs. She used to be Dolly Enser. And ourselves, besides Cooling and Vincent Bland. And the pick of the company. Katani does the food and drink. Phew! I don't believe I've forgotten a single thing." Then his tone changed to one of deep import. He pointed to the armchair from which Farncombe had risen. "Sit down a minute," he went on, sliding along the settee so as to come nearer. "Are you waiting to see Lily this afternoon?" I should like to," said Farncombe diffidently. "Because if Jayes should happen to drop in while you are here—" "Captain Jayes?" "Yes, Nico Jayes. Or if you knock up against him tonight at the theater, mum about this." "About the supper, you mean?" Roper nodded emphatically. Yes, of course. We don't want Nico Jays. We simply don't want him. And if he heard that you and some of the boys were coming, he might wonder why he wasn't included. Viscount Farncombe considered the point for a moment. He strikes me as being a rather surly, ill-conditioned person, he remarked, seeing that Roper evidently expected him to say something. A regular loafer, agreed the other. He appears to live at Catani's. I never go there without meeting him. The stockbroker spread wide his hands and pursed his lips. He had never forgiven Nico for daring to thrust himself into Lily Paradel's life. Exactly, he said, affecting an air of commiseration. Catani's and a top-back bedroom in Jermyn Street. And hanging about the Pandora. That's Nico Jays all the time. Farncombe hardly cared to enter con amour into a backbiting discussion regarding anyone whom Lily Paradel received on the terms which he fancied were accorded to Jays. He's quite an old friend of Mrs. Upjohn's, and of Miss Paradel's, too, isn't he? He asked. Roper evaded the point. Known him some time, of course, he answered airily. That's it. That's the complete explanation. Lily's so jolly faithful to her old friends. You oughtn't to complain of that, commented Farncombe smilingly. Oh, but I'm a real friend, declared Roper. I've always been a patron of musical drama. It's my fad. And I kept an eye on Lily long before she sprang into prominence. Do you remember Mind the Paint, Mind the Paint? And he sang the words gaily. Why, I've looked after her like a father. Uncle Lal, she calls me. Seeing that his hearer was somewhat taken aback by the decisive claim he had put forward to exercise an avuncular right of discretion with regard to Lily's associates, he added reassuringly, I'm a married man, you know, but the wife has plenty to occupy her with the kids, and she leaves the drama to me. She prefers Bexhill. Then, thinking to strike the iron while it was hot, he leaned forward and spoke with great emphasis. Farncombe, what a charming creature! Mrs. Roper? Inquired the Viscount innocently. No, dash it all. I'm talking about Lily. Oh, and so's my missus, for that matter, when she chooses. But Lily Upjohn. His cracked voice rose in a crescendo of admiration. Ah, said Farncombe in the low, reverent tone of one speaking of a goddess. She's beautiful, perfectly beautiful. Yes, and as good as she's beautiful, you take it from me. Feeling he had gone far enough, he dismissed the topic with a wave of the hand. Well, if you see Jays, you won't... He ended abruptly. But Farncombe fully understood. Not a syllable, he said. Roper, virtuously conscious that he had done his duty, rose and walked across the room, yielding to that incurable propensity of his to be always on the move. I've warned the others, he began, but broke off to say hastily, By the by, if Lily should mention the supper in the course of conversation, remember she's not in the conspiracy. Conspiracy? The younger man did not seem to like the word, but the deus ex machina of a scheme which contemplated the shutting out of an undesirable from that night's joyous festivity determined to put matters clearly. To shunt Nico, he insisted, we're letting her think there are to be no outsiders. Roper hardly understood that a certain type of man needed a very gentle touch on the reins when being brought over such difficult ground. Obviously, Farncombe found some puzzling element in the project. Why? Came the question. Would she very much like Captain Jays to be asked? The fussy stockbroker was becoming slightly impatient. This young gentleman was altogether too considerate of other people's feelings. Life is hard in many respects, as any man quickly discovers after a novitiate passed in the peculiar atmosphere of Capel Court. You don't seem to grasp the proposition, he declared. Haven't I told you? Once you're a friend of Lil's. The door opened, but Roper's alert eyes were on it before anyone became visible. Is this Ma? He cried. Yes, it was Ma, podgy and stupidly good-humored as ever. Ma, attired in an expensive dress designed for a woman several inches taller and slimmer and many years younger. But she carried herself gaily and tripped into the room with a pleasant smile on her contented features. "Hello, Uncle," she said. Roper greeted her with an excited flourish which conveyed at once a welcome and an indication that there was someone of consequence in the room. "Lord Farncombe," he explained grandiloquently. Mrs. Upjohn, who would not have been disconcerted in the least had he announced that the visitor was of royal blood, advanced and shook hands cordially. "Glad to see yer here again," she chirped. "Y'ave been before, haven't you?" "Last week," said Farncombe, smiling apologetically. Of course. You came with Mr. Bertie Fulkerson. But somebody or other's always popping in." Suddenly bethinking herself that she must not encourage promiscuous callers, she added, "Lilsey's too many, I say. It's tiring for her. Won't you set down?" Roper essayed valiantly to change the conversation. Mrs. Upjohn's modes of expression were altogether too candid. "Lord Farncombe has brought Lily some flowers, ma," he said. "Where are they?" he asked, turning with the quickness of a robin. The young viscount waited until Mrs. Upjohn had settled herself comfortably on the settee in front of the writing table. Then he took a chair near her and pointed to the basket of white and pink roses. "On the piano," he said. Unhappily, the good lady barely glanced at the delightful bouquet. "How kind of you!" she said. "Such a waste of money, too. They do go off so quick." Roper, concealing his impatience with an ill grace, affected to read the cards attached to the various floral gifts. "Where is Lil?" he demanded. "She's settin' to a risin' young artist in Fitzroy Street. Claude Morgan his name is," said Mrs. Upjohn. "And she won't be 'ome till past 5. It's so tirin' for her. I don't know why—" "Never heard of Morgan," broke in Roper. "No, nor anybody else? That's what I tell her. Why waste your time givin' settins to a risin' young artist when the big men 'ud go down on their 'ands and knees to do you? But that's Lil all over. She's the best natured girl in the world, and so she gets imposed on all round." Uncle Lal clenched his hands in sheer desperation, but Farncombe gallantly came to the rescue. "I prophesy that Mr. Morgan's picture won't have dried before he's quite famous," he said. The effort fell flat on the person for whom it was chiefly intended. Mrs. Upjohn turned a pair of dull eyes full upon him. "How do you mean?" she cried. Quite disconcerted, Farncombe tried to explain. I mean," he stammered. "Why won't it have dried?" inquired Mrs. Upjohn, clinging to the one fact which had penetrated her narrow intelligence. With an effort, the guardsman pulled his wits together. "I mean he will have become celebrated before it has dried," he said. "'Is pictures never do dry, you mean?" persisted Mrs. Upjohn. Roper was again bathed in a profuse perspiration. Really, his protégé's mother was too impossible. "No, ma," he broke in despairingly. But Mrs. Upjohn swept aside the difficulty as immaterial. "However, it doesn't really matter," she sighed. "'E isn't even going to put her name to it." "Why not?" said Roper hopelessly. He dreaded what she might say next. "You may well ask. He's bent on callin' it the Mind the Paint Girl." "But what's wrong with that? Everybody will recognize who that is." Ma was utterly unconvinced. "'Er name's printed on all 'er photos," she said plaintively. Farncombe tried his hand again. Though not widely experienced in the ways of this strange world into which he had wandered, he realized at least that it was highly important to win the good graces of the mother of the divinity at whose shrine he worshipped. "Miss Paradel's nickname is well known," he said. "The first time I had the pleasure of seeing your daughter on the stage, Mrs. Upjohn, the man next to me said, 'Here comes the Mind the Paint girl.' So the picture will possess an excellent label." Mrs. Upjohn decided to cheer up and look at things in the best light. "Oh, well," she cried, "perhaps young Morgan knows his own business best. Let's hope so, at any rate." Roper, who, to use one of his favorite idioms, was dancing about like a cat on hot bricks, beckoned to Farncombe. "I watch you," he said in a stage aside. The other was mystified, but rose instantly. Excusing himself to the lady, whose contributions to the talk were so jerky and disturbing, he joined Roper. Mrs. Upjohn was conscious only of escaping from a tedious conversation. She went to the writing table and sat down to examine the jewelry with unconcealed delight. "Do me a favor," whispered Roper in Farncombe's ear. "Certainly." The stockbroker consulted his watch. "It is only 4:30," he said in the same subdued tone. "Take a turn round the square. I've some business to discuss with the old lady." Farncombe nodded and crossed the room to Mrs. Upjohn. "I think I'll go for a little walk and come back later on, if I may," he explained smilingly. His hostess was quite contented, ridiculously so, in Roper's opinion. "Oh, just as you like," she said. "I'll return in about a quarter of an hour," said Farncombe. "If we don't see you again, I'll tell Lil you been here," she cried, still fingering the presents. But Farncombe was not to be put off, even in this downright fashion. "Oh, but you will," he cried. "You will see me again." "Well, please yourself, and you'll please your dearest friend, as Lil's dad used to say," came the parting shot from the table. The concession was not a great one, but it sufficed. Thank you very much," said the Viscount, and he went out, closing the door behind him. Then Mrs. Upjohn seemed to become aware of an unusual atmosphere. She turned and looked at the furious Roper. "I believe you gave that young man the int to go, uncle," she said. "So I did. I told him I wanted to talk business with you." The words were blurted out with a species of repressed fury, but Mrs. Upjohn was impervious to Uncle Lowell's sarcasm. "Business?" she cried indifferently, and resumed her inspection of the glittering array of trinkets on the table. She picked up one and examined it critically. "This is a handsome thing Mr. Grimwood sent her," she purred. The stockbroker thrust his hands deep in his trouser pockets and contemplated her with an air of desperation that would have been comical in a French farce. "Upon my soul, Ma, you're a champion!" he roared. Mrs. Upjohn understood that when a man shouted he was annoyed, so she condescended to give her attention to whatsoever grievance Roper was harboring. "Now what have I done?" she cried plaintively. "Well, you might spread yourself a little over young Farncombe," came the angry explosion. "Spread myself? Why should I?" "Confound it! He's Lord Farncombe, a real live lord, Ma!" Mrs. Upjohn snapped her fingers. "I treat 'em all alike. So does Lil," she said carelessly. "And he's not the first title we've had here, not by a dozen." Her smug self-content got on Roper's nerves. "No, but damn it all," he began. Then he recollected himself. "I beg your pardon," he said. Mrs. Upjohn beamed expansively. She knew that somehow, she could not tell exactly in what way, she had put her critic out of court. "So you ought," she said, "swearing like a trooper." "But this chap's in love with her," Roper explained frenziedly. Mrs. Upjohn giggled. She had heard that story so often. "Oh, they're all in love with her, or have been, one time or another." "Yes, but they're not all Farncombes, and they're not all marrying men. And I'm prepared to bet my boots that if Lil and young Farncombe could be thrown together—" Resolving to bring matters to an issue in so far as Lily's mother was concerned, he sat down springingly on a settee and invited her to join him. "Here," he said, "do talk it over." But Mrs. Upjohn was not to be cajoled out of her placid attitude. "Where's the use of talking it over? It's wasting one's breath. My Lil doesn't want to marry. Anyhow, not yet awhile. She's quite happy and contented as she is. When she does, I suppose it'll be the captain." She spoke with such calm acceptance of the inevitable, and smoothed out her skirts so contentedly, that Roper was stirred to real indignation. "The captain!" he repeated, and his utterance was not loud now, but hissing and venomous. "Ma, the day Lil marries Nick O'Jays, you and she will see the last of me." His voice rose on the concluding word with a sinister emphasis that did finally succeed in disturbing Mrs. Upjohn's equanimity. "Oh, don't say that, uncle!" she cried. "But I do say it. The disappointment would be more than I could stand. He is a selfish, designing beggar." "Now, no abuse, uncle. I don't like it." That was Mrs. Upjohn's way. Whenever she was cornered in an argument, she would evade the direct issue by a remark of that kind. But Roper was not to be placated. He was determined to thrash this matter out once and for all. "A fellow who gets on the soft side of Lil before she is out of her teens," he cried passionately, "before she's made any position to speak of, and when she has made a position and he's practically on his uppers, sticks to her like a limpet. It's sickening, that's what it is." "But she sticks to him, too," Mrs. Upjohn reminded him. "It meant a great deal to Lil in her humble days. You must recollect that she should receive attentions from a gentleman in the army. She doesn't forget that, and I don't blame her for it." Roper was not to be pacified. Mrs. Upjohn had tacitly refused to be seated. So he jumped up from the settee and walked to and fro. "It's cruel, that's what it is, just cruel," he muttered. "Here's Gwenny Harker and Maidie Travail, both married to peers' sons, and Eva Shafto to a baronet, all of them Pandora girls. And our Lil is left high and dry, engaged to a nobody. It's cruel. There's no other word for it." "She's not actually engaged," demurred Mrs. Upjohn. Roper puckered his lips disdainfully. "The idea was," went on the good lady, "when he shirked going to India and gave up soldiering so as to be nearer, that he should get something to do in London. Then they were to be engaged." The stout stockbroker laughed sarcastically. Nature had intended him for a low comedian, and he did really look ridiculous now that he was genuinely in a rage. "Oh, to be just, I admit he's in no hurry," he snapped. "He's been a whole year looking for something to do in London. Looking for it at Kitani's and at the Pandora bars." Mrs. Upjohn was growing concerned and tried to mollify him. "Do be fair, Uncle Lal," she said. "He has to be on the spot at night to bring Lil home after her work." But she had only succeeded in providing another bone of contention. "Exactly," fumed Roper. "And when a decent, eligible young chap comes along and means business, he's choked off by finding Nico J's in possession." Halting suddenly before Mrs. Upjohn, he said impressively, "Now you mark what I am telling you. Farncombe has not tumbled to it yet." Mrs. Upjohn was becoming indifferent again. She certainly did not know what he meant. "Hasn't he?" she said. "No. Bertie Fulkerson has held his tongue about it. So have the other boys, who are friends of Farncombe's. They see he's hard hit. Oh, they're good boys. They're good, loyal boys." And Roper's manner changed suddenly to one of supreme content. "There's not one of them who wouldn't throw up his hat if Nico got the chuck." Then he bent over her and said, "Ma," so impressively that Mrs. Upjohn was startled. "Eh? What is it?" she cried. Roper sank his voice again to a fitting note of intimacy. "You've heard about this little spree at the theater? Lil thinks it's to be merely among the members of the company." "But ain't it?" "No, it isn't. You keep quiet now. Not a word." "'Oo else?" began Mrs. Upjohn. "The boys and Farncombe," whispered Roper dramatically. At last his hearer's armor was pierced. This revelation disturbed her greatly. "Gracious!" she cried. "There'll be an awful fuss with the captain tomorrow." "Pish!" Roper snapped his fingers. But Mrs. Upjohn was not satisfied. "He's so horribly jealous," she wailed. "When Lil tells him who was at the party, there'll be a frightful kick-up." Roper knew that as well as she did, and a fit of despondency seized him momentarily. "Oh, I dare say I'm a fool for my pains, Ma," he muttered. "Nothing'll come of it. Farncombe's as shy as a schoolgirl. He'd be on a desert island with a pretty woman for a month without squeezing her hand." Curiously enough, Mrs. Upjohn was beginning to see light, while Uncle Lal was becoming enveloped in gloom. "Bear in mind," she said thoughtfully, "I shouldn't raise any objection if Lil could be weaned away from the captain, and took a fancy to young Farncombe." Objection! The little man called the gods to witness that women were an order unto themselves. Mrs. Upjohn was thinking hard now, and pursued her line with blissful heedlessness of Uncle Lad's satire. "When all's said and done," she communed aloud, To be Lady F, with no need to work if you're not disposed to, is better than being Mrs. Captain J's and having to linger on the stage, perhaps till you drop, to help keep the pot a boiling. Lady F. Her eyes were wide open now. She was daydreaming. Roper took heart. She had come round to the right humor at last. "And Countess of Godalming when his father dies," he prompted her. Mrs. Upjohn instantly looked far into the future. "I suppose there'd be any amount of unpleasantness with the family?" she reflected. "The family!" Roper snorted disdainfully. "But there is generally a rumpus in such cases." Her friend was ready to deal with that objection decisively. "Why, Ma," he said, "these tip-top families ought to feel jolly grateful that we're mixing the breed for them a bit. Look at the two lads who have married Gwenny Harker and Maidie Trevelle. Even Eva Shafto's husband. They haven't a chin or a forehead between 'em, and their chests are as narrow as a 10-inch plank." "Quite true," nodded Mrs. Upjohn. In her own quiet way she had noted these defects for herself. "And Farncombe himself," continued Roper, warming to the task, "he's inclined to be weedy. I maintain it's a grand thing for our English nobs that their slips of sons have taken to marrying young women of Lil's stamp. Keen-witted young women, full of the joy of life, with strong frames, beautiful hair and fine eyes, and healthy pink gums and big white teeth. They sneer at the Pandora girls. Great Scott, it's my belief that the Pandora girls will be the salvation of the aristocracy in this country in the long run." "Hush!" murmured Ma. And Captain Nicholas Jays lounged in. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of The Mind the Paint Girl. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. The Mind the Paint Girl by Louis Tracy. Chapter 7. An Interlude. Jays and Roper frankly disliked each other, and neither took any marked pains to conceal the fact. The army man regarded the eccentric but somewhat vulgar little stockbroker as a bounder, while Roper's opinion of Jays is already on record. The mere presence of Uncle Lal was an instant source of irritation to Jays, and possibly for that very reason he did not notice Roper's rather guilty air, nor Ma's propitiatory grin. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Upjohn. How are you, Roper?" he said as he closed the door. "Ah, Captain," smirked the lady. "Hello, Nico," said Roper offhandedly. "Lily not in?" Jays came nearer. He was not so well groomed as he used to be in the old days, but he still carried himself with an air of authority, and he permitted his eyes to rest for a contemptuous second on Roper's magnificent waistcoat. "No," said Mrs. Upjohn. "She's in Fitzroy Street, settin' to Morgan." "Why didn't she ask me to go with her?" frowned Jays. "Don't know, I'm sure. She's took Miss Birch." "Oh," grunted Jays, slightly placated. Then his glance surveyed the display of flowers. Evidently he disapproved of so many admirers, whereupon Roper, to annoy him, jerked his head towards the writing table. "Some nice presents over there," he said. "She's beat her record this year, Lil has, out and out," purred Mrs. Upjohn complacently, little dreaming that she was adding fuel to the fire. Jays strode across the room and scowled at the array of jewelry. "Very nice," he muttered. He took up one of the cases and read the card on it, only to throw it back angrily. "Confound 'em!" he cried. "What the devil do they take her for?" "Allow me to remark, Jays, that one of those gifts is from me," spluttered Roper. "Oh, I'm not alluding to you." "Much obliged." Jays disregarded Roper's fuming. He turned and addressed Mrs. Upjohn. "I've called in to ask Lily whether she'll come out to supper with me tonight at Kitani's to celebrate her birthday. Luigi is decorating a table for me specially. Mr. and Mrs. Linthorpe will come, and Jack Wethered, and my brother, the Rhodesian one. Are you free, Roper? I suppose it's no good asking you, Mrs. Upjohn." Jayes included Roper in the invitation as he might fling a bone to a dog. But the stockbroker had found some object to interest him near the tea table, and Mrs. Upjohn, left to her own resources, moved uneasily. "No, no, thank you, Captain," she stammered. "And I'm afraid Lil can't manage it either." "Why not?" Jayes rapped out the obvious question in a court-martial voice. I'm surprised she didn't mention it to you herself when you brought her home last night." "Mention what?" "They're giving her a supper tonight at the theater." "At the theater?" Roper thought it high time to interfere. Ma might blurt out too much if hard pressed. "Yes," he broke in. "Carlton is standing a little spread in the foyer in honor of the occasion. And quite right, too. Lily is his best asset, and chance it." "When was this fixed up?" demanded Jayes. "Late last night." Jayes was disconcerted. He felt perhaps that his manner was too inquisitorial. "The fact is," he explained hesitatingly, "I was rather quiet coming home in the car last night, and I suppose Lil kept this from me, to pay me out." Then some vague suspicion prompted him to wheel round sharply on Roper. "Who's invited?" he asked. "Oh, only the principal members of the company, I understand." Mrs. Upjohn moistened her lips and added, in what she deemed was a most convincing tone, "Yes, only the members of the company, Lil says." "With Maury Cooling and Vincent Bland thrown in," said Roper. Therein he went too far. Jayes fastened on to the admission instantly. "You seem to know a lot about it," he growled. "Well, you see, I was behind when Maury was going round to the dressing rooms." "Are you asked?" "Oh, out with it, man. Are you asked?" "Oh, yes, they've dragged me into it." "Since when have you been a member of the company?" "No, but dash it all, Nico, I've done business for Carlton in the city for 20 years or more." "That doesn't make you—" "And I'm an old friend of Lil's, remember." "You haven't known her so much longer than I. Why the blazes doesn't Carlton invite me?" Roper was growing hot again. He extended his arms as though to ward off this big man towering over him. "My dear Nico," he cried, "I'm not giving the party. Really, you do jump down one's throat." "Sorry, sorry." Jayes thrust his hands into his pockets and gazed blankly at the carpet. "Well, I'll put off my brother and the others. They won't want to sup with me. I shouldn't amuse them. Her birthday, though. It will be the first time I shall have been out of that for how many years? 6 years. His outspoken reverie stopped suddenly, for he had caught the conspirators eyeing each other uncomfortably. "What's up now?" he cried. "Anything the matter?" "The matter?" repeated Roper, who was beginning to realize the anguish of a detected felon. "Yes. Any game on at my expense?" "Really, Captain, I don't know what you're driving at," said Mrs. Upjohn, who could not keep silent for the life of her. Jayes was thoroughly aroused now. He knew that these two were deceiving him in some way. "How long is Lily sitting this afternoon?" he said harshly. "Till 5," bleated Mrs. Upjohn. He glanced at his watch. "What's Morgan's number in Fitzroy Street?" 60. "Then I'll fetch her." He was making for the door when it was thrown open and Lily entered with a rush. With her came Jimmy Birch, and the two girls looked as though they had been hurrying. Lily tore off her gloves. "Whew! I'm dead!" she cried. "I couldn't stand the heat in the studio any longer, Mother." "Ah, Nico," extending a careless hand. Then, discovering Roper, she offered her cheek for a kiss. "Mon oncle, ça va bien," she said with an excellent accent. Miss Birch closed the door. "That young man Morgan ought to paint the infernal regions," she declared. "He'd like it." "I wish he'd finish with the angels first," sighed Lily, taking a scarf off her shoulders. Then, thinking that she might have greeted Jayes rather coldly, she gave him a pleasant smile. "You in a better temper to day, Nico?" she asked softly. "You drove me wild last night," he murmured close to her ear. "Served you right," she said, making a little friendly face at him. "For goodness' sake, let me lie down." And she threw herself on a settee. "Don't come near me, any of you. Give me my fan. Jimmy, where's my fan?" "Oh, dear, I've left it in Fitzroy Street," said her friend. "Beast!" "There's one here among your presents," cried Mrs. Upjohn, going to the writing table. Lily unpinned her hat. "Uncle Lal, what an adorable ring that is you've sent me," she said. "Ring? I sent you a brooch." "Well, somebody has sent me a ring." "There's 3 rings," announced Mrs. Upjohn joyously. "Of course," said Lily. "One of them is from Nico. Did you get my sweet telegram, Nico?" "I had your telegram, but it is a pendant I sent you," said Jay sulkily, more than ever annoyed at finding himself put on the same plane as Roper. Jimmy Birch did not help the situation by tittering audibly, but Lily was not to be disturbed by such trifles. "You shut up, Jimmy," she said. "How am I to remember? Who's given me this pretty thing?" she went on, looking at the fan, which she was using vigorously. "Mr. Monty Levine," said Mrs. Upjohn. "Bless him! He's a dear little man, though he does bite his nails." Gladys, the parlor maid, sailed in, followed by Vincent Bland. She did not content herself with announcing a visitor, but, seeing that her young mistress had returned, viewed her with elevated eyebrows. "Oh, are you at home?" she said. Lily returned the girl's stare rather amusedly. "Apparently," she said. "Then I'll whistle up to Maud," Maud being lady's maid in the Upjohn household. "Don't," said Lily, "if it's too severe a strain on you." Gladys moved away majestically. Mrs. Upjohn called after her, "We'll have tea." The parlor maid turned at the door. "You can't till it's ready," she announced. "What cheek!" said Lily calmly as the girl went out. Vincent Bland, a thin, delicate-looking man, not particularly well dressed, but carrying himself with distinction, and wearing a monocle as though he were used to it, strolled across the room. "You needn't have cut me almost on your doorstep. And why do you retain the services of that golden-haired hussy?" he said. "Oh, she's a bit above herself, but she's a perfect servant, and I never saw you," came the convincing answer. Bland allowed his glance to rest fixedly on Roper. "Congratulations on your waistcoat, Lal," he said. "Oh, I hate personalities," said Roper gruffly. Lily held out a hand to the composer. "Vincent," she said, "yours was one of the loveliest presents I've had to day." "Remerciement! How's that for an accent?" Bland dropped his eyeglass. "You cat!" he hissed. "You know I've given you nothing, not even a penny nosegay." Jimmy Birch, who had been chatting with Roper, evidently had an ear for other conversation in the room, because she laughed again shrilly, and Lily raised herself on an elbow. "On my honor, Vincent dear, I swear I thought—" she began. "The funds are too low," said Bland, replacing the eyeglass. "I did go so far as to price a bangle at Selby's, but that was before a certain event yesterday." "What horses did you back, Vincent?" inquired Miss Birch. "I won a $5 through Jerry Grimwood." Roper saw a chance to pay back Bland's reference to the waistcoat. "You are a patent ass," he said loudly. "Why don't you leave betting alone?" "Why don't you leave your city muck alone?" inquired Bland icily. Lily stood up. She thought it high time to take more interest in life. "Be quiet, you two," she said imperiously. "I won't have any wrangling in my house. Run away and play, all of you. Vin, come here a minute." She led him to a corner near the writing table and dropped her voice. There was no mistaking the intense feeling that vibrated in her next words. "You have broken your word to me, then? You have been following those damned horses again?" Bland made a wry face. "Cooling had a tip from the stable," he murmured. "Cooling!" she snapped. "Maury Cooling has no children, only a fat wife. You've a darling little wife and 3 kiddies. How much did you drop yesterday?" "Shan't say," declared Bland doggedly. "Oh, Vincent!" she cried, and the tears rose unbidden to her eyes. The others in the room knew that Lily was lecturing her friend, and left them alone. But Baron von Rettenmeier entered at that moment and marched straight up to Lily, clicking his heels as he halted in front of her, and bending like a 6-foot plank controlled by a hinge in the middle. "Aha, goddess!" he murmured. "Many happy returns of the day." "Hush!" said Lily. "I'm busy for a moment, Baron. Go and talk to Mother and Jimmy." "With pleasure," said von Rettenmeier. How are you, my dear ma? Delighted to see you, Jimmy. My dear Robert. My dear Nicholas. He greeted each of them in this cheerful strain, and Jimmy Birch promptly mimicked him. Robert, Nicholas, why don't they provide you with throat lozenges at the embassy? She cried. Under cover of the chatter which broke out, Lily opened a drawer in the writing table and produced a checkbook. After a furtive glance over her shoulder, she swept some of the presents aside and signed a check, which she tore out and slipped into Bland's hand. Now promise me, she whispered, promise me you won't make another bet this year. Bland calmly unfolded the check and scrutinized it. A blank one, he said grimly. Put it in your pocket. Don't fill it in for more than you can help. I'm not over flush. With calm deliberation, he tore the check into 4 pieces, and looking at her steadily, put them in his waistcoat pocket. I will keep these, Lil, as long as I keep anything, he said, though his voice was not so steady as his fingers. She flushed and flared up. You fool, Vincent, she cried. My dear, do you think... But Lily stamped her foot. She was genuinely vexed. Such ridiculous pride, she flung at him. Lord, what I owe to you. And you won't let me help you in a tight place. Luckily, a diversion was created by the entrance of Mr. Samuel de Castro, whose spats were whiter than ever. Bland hailed him as a deliverer, and de Castro lisped his congratulations to Lily. Thanks, dear old boy, she said, nodding at Bland, to indicate that her vengeance was only deferred. Did I send you a wire this morning? Not you, not a sixpenn'orth. I ought to have done so, to acknowledge your, now, what was it? A ring, my dear, diamonds and sapphires. Oh, yes, beautiful, gushed Lily, who was far too skilled an actress on the stage not to be able to act a little on her own account. It ith rather a nice ring, but I say, mind you don't go and tell Gaps on any account. And de Castro's tone became confidential. Lily raised her eyebrows with a fine assumption of ignorance. Gabs, Miss Cato, why shouldn't I tell her? But de Castro was too old a bird to be caught in that fashion. Nonsense, he said. You know very well. You won't, will you? Lily shrugged her pretty shoulders. She was minded to tease him. I won't, if I remember not to, she said airily. Sam became rather alarmed. Lily was no fool, he knew, but girls did stupid things occasionally. Ah, now, don't be silly, he pleaded. What's the good of making mischief? Whereupon, it is a regrettable fact that Miss Paradell showed him the tip of her tongue. He laughed, and von Rettenmeyer's hand fell heavily on his back. My dear friend Sam, he said, what is the joke? Lily held out her hand. Excuse me for cutting you short when you came in, Baron, she said. Thanks for your splendid present. I did send you a wire, didn't I? Von Rettenmeyer retained her hand, bowed solemnly, and kissed it. I shall preserve that telegram with other souvenirs till the end of my life, he vowed. Lily withdrew her hand and blew the compliment away, but the Baron had not done with her yet. After a cautious look around, he said in an altered tone, Goddess, about my trifling little offering, I entreat you not to mention it to Enid. Lily burst into a hearty laugh. What, another of you? She cried. Then she added seriously, Baron, I do wish you boys wouldn't make me presents and then ask me to keep it a secret from the other girls. And I, on my part, I wish it were not necessary. But, Goddess, you are also a young lady of the world, and you know what women are. The charming Miss Moncrief. Lily had seen her maid entering, so she turned away, throwing the enigmatical remark over her shoulder. Yes, and I know what you men are, too. The maid, whom Gladys had presumably whistled for, rushed at Miss Paradell with a complete disregard of the assembled company. Here, give me your things, she said. I was in my room having a lie down. Is my hair untidy? I've never seen it anything else, said Lily, tossing her hat, scarf, and gloves to the cheerful Maud, who laughed loudly at her mistress's banter and then hailed some of the guests. Good afternoon, Miss Jimmy, she said. Afternoon, Mr. de Castro. Turning to her mistress again, she became solicitous for her welfare. Now, don't you let them all tire you to death, there's a pet, she cried. "Oh, clear out," was the unsympathetic answer. As Maud was departing, Lily kicked off her shoes, pitching them dexterously after the girl. "Hi!" she cried. "Fetch me a pair of slippers." Maud stopped and giggled. At that moment Gladys entered with a tea tray, and Lord Farncombe at her heels. The superior parlor maid eyed her fellow domestic scornfully, and tried to wither her on the spot. "Oh, you're doing something, are you?" she said. "Yes, I'm setting you an example, my girl," answered Maud. Not looking where she was going to, she cannoned against the guardsman. "Beg pardon," she said amiably, and vanished. Lily Paradell, though shoeless, was in no wise abashed. She tiptoed to meet Lord Farncombe and held out her hand. "How do you do?" she said, smiling at him in a very friendly way. She was beginning to like this young man. He differed in many essential ways from the well-to-do idlers who frittered away the best part of their lives in attendance at the Pandora Theater. He was unassuming, diffident, yet frankly an admirer, and his attitude conveyed a grateful sense of the homage that takes no thought for rank. Any other girl in her position would have regarded him as a possible suitor, but Lily refused to look upon her men friends in that light. Still, he had touched some dormant chord in her nature. Not knowing why, she felt rather shy when speaking to him, though he himself was so bashful that Roper's description of him was by no means far-fetched. He moved swiftly now to meet her and take the proffered hand. "I have been here before this afternoon. I ventured to bring you some flowers," he said eagerly. "There now," said Lily. "Nobody told me. How awfully kind of you. Where have they put them?" He went to the piano, lifted down his basket of flowers, and showed it to her with a gentle diffidence that betrayed a lack of experience in such things. "Here they are," he said. "How pretty!" said Lily, pulling out a La France rose and adjusting it in her belt, knowing that she was paying a compliment to the donor. "Are you acquainted with most of the people here?" He looked around the room. "I know nearly everybody, I fancy," he said, nodding to von Rettenmeyer and De Castro. Then his glance fell on Jayes, who had worked his way round to the writing table, and was watching the two young people rather sourly, gnawing his mustache the while. "How are you, Captain Jayes?" said the Viscount pleasantly. "And you, Mr. Bland," he added. He turned to Lily again. "I've been talking to Mrs. Upjohn and Mr. Roper already," he explained. Lily introduced him to Jimmy Birch, and Farncombe gave additional proof of his lack of acquaintance with theatrical society by essaying an elaborate compliment. I need hardly say," he declared, "that I am one of Miss Birch's warmest, most profound—" The kindly Jimmy came to the rescue. "That's all right, Lord Farncombe," she smiled. "Don't you bother about saying nice things. You look them, and that's enough, isn't it, Lily?" Somehow the advent of the young Viscount had created an electrical atmosphere in the room. Lily had become more gracious, and gave more heed to the niceties of speech. Mrs. Upjohn, Roper, von Rettenmeyer, even the volatile Jimmy Birch were on the qui vive to say and do the right thing. And Nico Jayes, already suspicious with regard to some of them, and resentful of the indifference with which he was treated by most of the others, became aware of a new doubt, a new anxiety, which tore him with the ever-ready claws of jealousy. Was this handsome youngster a serious rival? He feared so. He must be on his guard, and above all, curb that unruly tongue of his. His brother's advice came back to him. Perhaps he had chosen an unfavorable time for urging his suit with Lily. At any rate, he could only wait and watch. But feeling himself to be little else than an outsider in this frivolous circle, he clenched his fists in sheer impotence. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of The Mind the Paint Girl. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Mind the Paint Girl by Louis Tracy. Chapter 8 Harmonies and Some Discords. The tousle-headed Maud came in with a pair of silk slippers, and von Rettenmeier, who would never be anything but an overgrown boy, rushed at her and grabbed them before she was aware of his intent. "Permit me," he said. Maud slapped his arm as if he were an impetuous milkman. "Now, Baron," she giggled, and there was quite a little struggle between them until he ran her out of the room. Then he cried, holding the capture triumphantly aloft: "Gentlemen, let us pay homage to beauty. Follow me, all of you. Zam, Vincent, Robert, Nigo, Eddie, line up." Jays deliberately seated himself at a distance, and Farncombe, who was decidedly embarrassed, hung back. But the others obeyed joyously. Jimmy Birch clapped her hands with appreciation, and Mrs. Upjohn, who was pouring out the tea, laughed herself into a fit of coughing. Von Rettenmeier, putting a hand to his mouth, imitated a brass band with drum effects. Then, changing to the staccato commands of a German drill instructor, he shouted: "Links, recht, quick march," and headed the procession round the room. "Baron, you great baby!" cried Lily, blushing scarlet at the mock ceremony proposed in her honor. Roper, seeing that the young viscount was not in the queue, cried gleefully, "Come along, Farncombe!" And Miss Birch encouraged him with a dig in the ribs. Whereupon he, too, joined in the revel. Von Rettenmeier, thoroughly in his element when engaged in this sort of nonsense, waved the slippers in air and began to sing in a rich, full baritone: "Weib, was ist in aller Welt, dir in Schönheit gleichgestellt, Reis Flossen, wunderhold, Perl der Schöpfung, Herz en Gold, Tagsgedanken, Traum der Nacht, schweben dich, Sus, sagt, Venus, seinen Machen Beaut, der dein Sklav, Dienstbereit." The following is a free translation: "Woman, earth holds not more dear, you alone can be your peer. Charming, graceful in full measure, rarest pearl, heart's fondest treasure. My waking thoughts, my dreams by night, hover round you, vision bright. Venus, bid me but to stay, your slave forever and a day." He timed the promenade so adroitly that when the end of his song was reached, he was on one knee before Lily. She, entering laughingly into the frolic, extended her left foot, and he kissed her instep before adjusting the slipper, being rewarded with a light box on the ears. He made way for Di Castro, handing him the remaining slipper, and the literary celebrity performed the same rite with much empressement, whereupon Lily dexterously upset his balance. Bland and Roper perforce contented themselves by kissing her instep, but when the girl found Farncombe looking at her hesitatingly, she raised her eyes to his in a distinctly self-conscious way and withdrew her foot. "No, no," she murmured, shaking her head decisively. "Don't you be silly like the others." "Tea!" cried Mrs. Upjohn loudly. Ma might be tactless enough in speech, but being a woman, she had a sharp eye where flirtation was concerned. Moreover, she was rather alarmed by the attitude